It began in the frozen heart of Ukraine, in a world of ice, smoke, and silence broken only by the rumble of engines and the cries of the dying. It was the winter of 1944, and the Eastern Front was collapsing into chaos. The once invincible Wehrmacht was bleeding out across the endless steppe, retreating through snow and mud, chased by the relentless tide of the Red Army. But in that winter wasteland near the towns of Korsun and Cherkassy, one of the most brutal and desperate battles of the war would unfold. An encirclement so savage it became known to both sides as the Little Stalingrad of the Dnieper. The Battle of the Korsun-Cherkassy Pocket was not just a military disaster or a victory, it was a human inferno, a frozen slaughterhouse where entire divisions vanished beneath the snow, and where men fought not for conquest, but for escape, for breath, for life itself. By January 1944, the Eastern Front was in flames. The Soviet Union, reborn from the ashes of Stalingrad and Kursk, had driven the Germans westward in a relentless offensive. Hitler's grand gamble in the east had turned to ruin. The mighty army group south, once the spearhead of Barbarossa, now reeled under the weight of the Soviet juggernaut. The First and Second Ukrainian fronts, commanded by Generals Vatutin and Konev, had crossed the Dnieper River and were slicing deep into occupied Ukraine, threatening to encircle vast portions of the German line. In the middle of this maelstrom lay the 11th and 42nd Army Corps, along with elements of SS Viking and Wallonian divisions, around 60,000 men strung thin along a frozen salient near the towns of Korsun and Cherkassy. Their orders from Hitler were simple and insane. Hold your ground, no retreat, no surrender. But Stalin and his generals saw their opportunity. They would close the jaws around Korsun and crush the Germans once more in a cauldron of ice and fire. The Soviet offensive began on January 24, 1944. From north and south, Soviet armored and infantry formations surged forward in blizzards and sub-zero cold. The 5th Guards Tank Army struck from the north, while 2nd Ukrainian Front's 5th Guards Cavalry Corps attacked from the south. Within days, the trap snapped shut. The German pocket, a bulge in the front barely 20 miles wide, was sealed. Inside were 6 divisions, the 5th SS Viking, the 72nd, 88th, 57th, 389th, and 5th Panzer Divisions, along with thousands of support troops, artillery and refugees. They were surrounded, cut off from supplies, cut off from hope. The Red Army poured artillery into the pocket, turning every frozen road into a corridor of death. Snow mixed with blood, the temperature dropped below -20, and the earth itself seemed to mourn. At first, the German High Command refused to acknowledge the disaster. Hitler forbade any breakout, ordering the encircled forces to hold until relief could come. It was Stalingrad all over again, the same arrogance, the same denial. But inside the pocket, General Wilhelm Stemmermann, commander of the trapped forces, knew the truth. Ammunition was running low, food was gone. The wounded froze in their foxholes, unable to be evacuated. Every attempt to resupply by air failed. Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft fire tearing apart the lumbering transports. The pocket shrank by the day. Soviet artillery rained down on German positions, and Soviet infantry closed in, house by house, trench by trench. The defenders fought with grim determination. Every barn, every hill, every grove of trees became a fortress. They fought not for victory, but for survival. Outside the encirclement, German relief forces under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein and General Hermann Breith launched a desperate counteroffensive. From the west, armored divisions of Army Group South tried to punch through to the trapped troops. It was a brutal, grinding battle against time and terrain, tanks mired in snowdrifts, engines freezing, men collapsing in exhaustion. The Soviet forces resisted fiercely, throwing wave after wave of infantry and armor to keep the ring closed. Every mile gained cost dozens of lives. Yet somehow, against impossible odds, the relief force crept closer. Inside the pocket, Stemmermann's men listened to the distant rumble of artillery, the sound of salvation, and prepared for one final gamble. On the night of February 16th, 1944, as the pocket burned and the Soviets closed in for the kill, Stemmermann gave the order to break out. It was a march through hell. Columns of men, vehicles and horses moved silently through the snow, leaving the wounded behind, carrying the dying on sledges. The moon was pale, the air filled with smoke and ice. Soviet searchlights swept the night like blades. The Germans had to cross the Gniloy-Tikich river, swollen with ice and blood, under constant artillery fire. Those who fell into the freezing water were swept away, horses drowned. Men froze mid-step, units disintegrated into chaos. Soviet machine guns cut through the dark. It was no longer a battle, it was slaughter. And yet through sheer will and desperation, thousands broke through. When the sun rose on February 17th, the battlefield was a landscape of horror. Thousands of corpses littered the snow. The riverbanks were piled with wreckage and frozen bodies. General Stemmermann himself was killed by a shell as he tried to escape, his body later found beside his car. Of the 60,000 men who had been trapped, fewer than 35,000 made it out. The rest were dead or captured. The Red Army had achieved its victory. Another great encirclement on the road to Berlin, but at a terrible cost. Soviet losses were enormous, over 80,000 killed or wounded. The Germans, though shattered, had escaped total annihilation, but the myth of their invincibility was gone forever. The Korsun-Cherkassy Pocket had shown the world that the Eastern Front had become a war of endurance, not maneuver, a contest of exhaustion, where victory and defeat blurred in the snow. For those who survived, the memories never faded. They spoke of men frozen to the ground, of screams carried on the wind, of comrades left behind in the dark. They remembered the stench of death mingling with the smell of burning fuel, the sky glowing red from artillery fire. And they remembered the silence that followed, the kind of silence that only comes after everything human has been stripped away. For the Red Army, Korsun was a step closer to victory, proof that the Wehrmacht could be broken again and again. For the Germans it was a lesson they would never forget. The age of triumph was over. The long retreat to the Reich had begun. Today, the fields around Korsun and Cherkassy are peaceful, covered in snow each winter, just as they were in 1944. Beneath that quiet earth lie tens of thousands of men from both sides, still where they fell, their stories frozen in time. The wind that sweeps across the steppe carries whispers of their struggle, of courage, futility, and endurance. Tonight we return to that frozen battlefield, to the smoke, the hunger, and the unyielding will to survive. This is the entire history of the Battle of the Korsun-Cherkassy Pocket, the Eastern Front encirclement that became a monument to desperation, and the winter where the dying Wehrmacht learned what it meant to be hunted. Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you tonight? The Ukrainian steppe lay frozen beneath a pale January sky, its vastness stretching endlessly in silence. Snow softened the scars of old battles, covering broken fences and abandoned trenches with a white shroud. Trees stood brittle and still, their branches weighed with frost, as though nature itself held its breath. Villages nestled quietly in the landscape, smoke curling slowly from chimneys into the crisp air. Horses stood tethered in courtyards, their breath steaming in clouds of silver mist. Children carried buckets from frozen wells, boots crunching softly in the hard snow. Soldiers on both sides walked patrols with shoulders hunched against the cold, their thoughts heavy but unspoken. Along the winding rivers, ice clung to the banks like glass, cracked in places by the shifting current. In these frozen days of early 1944, the land itself seemed caught between waiting and remembering, and in that stillness, the story of Korsun's encirclement quietly began to unfold. The Germans held a bulge in the front lines near the towns of Korsun and Cherkassy, a salient stretching dangerously into Soviet territory. It was a position born of stubbornness, clung to despite exhaustion, and the long retreat from the previous summer. After the great clash at Kursk, where their armoured might was broken, the German armies had slowly fallen back westward. Each withdrawal left scars of burned villages and abandoned equipment, a trail of fading strength across the steppe. Yet in this winter of 1944, they still held on, convinced that yielding further would mean unraveling the entire southern front. Hitler had ordered the salient defended, unwilling to relinquish a foothold that might one day be used to strike again. His words were heavy chains on commanders in the field, who saw the risks more clearly than Berlin allowed. For them the bulge was not a fortress but a trap waiting to be sprung. Still, orders were orders, and the soldiers dug in with weary discipline. And so the bulge remained quiet in the snow, fragile and exposed. Across the front, the Soviets were watching with patient intent, their preparations unfolding with the steadiness of a winter river. Their armies had gained momentum after Kursk, learning from defeats and building confidence in victory. Factories far behind the lines poured out tanks and guns, each one destined for the endless fields of Ukraine. Men and women worked long hours in harsh conditions, driven by the belief that the war could be won. Red Army divisions moved silently into staging areas, hidden by forests and camouflaged by snow. Supplies were stockpiled in barns and depots, brought forward by horse and truck alike. Commanders walked the frozen ground with maps in hand, marking routes and bridges that would one day carry their assault. Intelligence whispered through villages, as partisans shadowed the movements of German units. To the German eye it was quiet, almost reassuringly so. But beneath the quiet, the ground itself seemed to hum with the weight of gathering force. The people of Ukraine endured the winter with patience, caught between armies yet again. Villagers gathered wood for fires, their breath freezing in the night as they huddled together for warmth. Old men spoke in hushed tones of past wars, remembering invasions and retreats across the same endless steppe. Women mended clothes by candlelight, their needles flashing in dim rooms filled with the smell of smoke and bread. Children played in the snow when they could, laughter brief but defiant against the hardships of war. In some villages, soldiers were billeted in barns, their boots lined along walls, like silent reminders of conflict. In others, the front was distant, yet the sound of far-off artillery drifted faintly through the cold air. Daily life continued in fragments, fragile but enduring. Even amid uncertainty, there was resilience in the rhythm of survival, and in that endurance the land seemed to prepare itself for the storm that would soon arrive. For the German soldiers within the salient, the winter days stretched long and weary. Trenches were dug into frozen earth, their walls reinforced with logs and snow. Rations were meagre, though enough to stave off hunger, and mail from home arrived in uneven streams. Fires burned low in dugouts, the smoke creeping through makeshift chimneys into the cold sky. Officers studied maps in lamplight, tracing lines that curved precariously around Korsun. They spoke of strength, of holding fast, though their eyes betrayed unease. Patrols moved cautiously into the white fields, rifles slung low, their tracks erased quickly by drifting snow. Wounded men were sent back when possible, though the journey was long and uncertain. Every day seemed to whisper of something approaching, though none could say when or how it would come. And so the soldiers waited, wrapped in the deceptive calm of winter. On the Soviet side, soldiers too endured the season, with a mixture of hardship and resolve. Their uniforms were warmer, their supplies steadier, yet the cold still seeped through every layer of cloth. Long marches carried them across endless snowfields, boots heavy, faces raw from icy wind. Yet there was an air of purpose, a sense that each step was leading closer to a final reckoning. Soviet officers spoke quietly of encirclement, of cutting the bulge and trapping its defenders. Maps showed arrows converging, the promise of a pocket that would hold the enemy fast. Morale was lifted by the thought of victories to come, though the cost was understood by all. Soldiers sang songs around fires, voices carrying into the dark, as if to push back the night. In their hearts, they carried a determination born of suffering, sharpened by the memory of retreat. And as the days moved on, their patience grew into quiet anticipation. The larger war pressed upon this corner of Ukraine with invisible weight. Far to the north, Leningrad had been lifted from its long siege, and in the south, Crimea was once again threatened. The Red Army was no longer the battered force of 1941, but a vast machine that moved with growing confidence. The Wehrmacht, once masters of the eastern plains, now struggled to find its balance. Supplies were scarce, reinforcements fewer, and faith in victory grew thin. Yet pride and obedience still bound them to their lines, even as the tide of war turned more clearly each month. Commanders spoke of strategy and orders, but soldiers saw only the snow and the endless horizon. The front line itself was fragile, a thread stretched across a land too wide to hold. In such vast silence, the clash of empires seemed almost unreal, like thunder waiting behind the clouds. And in that waiting the first notes of encirclement began to form. As January deepened, the stillness of the steppe grew heavier, like a curtain drawn across a stage before a hidden play. Days were short, the sun pale and fleeting, while night stretched long with a cold that bit to the bone. Fires flickered in villages and dugouts, offering warmth against the vast emptiness. The land seemed caught in suspension, holding its breath for an event unseen but deeply felt. Both armies stared across the snowfields, aware yet uncertain of what the other prepared. In the hearts of many, there was a sense of inevitability, a quiet recognition that change was near. The Germans clung to orders, the Soviets to plans, and the people to survival. All were bound together by the frozen earth beneath their feet. The silence of January carried with it the weight of futures soon to be decided. And into that silence, February crept, bearing the storm that would break the curtain at last. Army Group South stretched across Ukraine like a thread drawn too tightly, thin and strained against the vastness of the land. Its divisions were scattered along hundreds of miles of front, each one burdened with too much ground to cover. Villages became outposts, and rivers became fragile defensive lines, held by soldiers who were weary from months of retreat. Supplies trickled in unevenly, arriving late or in small amounts, never enough to ease the burden of men and horses. Commanders looked at their maps and saw not strength but vulnerability, as lines bent and bulged in awkward shapes. The salient around Korsun, jutting forward into Soviet territory, stood out as a dangerous weakness. Within it 6 divisions clustered together, separated from their neighbors and far from reliable support. Officers knew it could be encircled with a single determined strike, yet orders insisted it be held at all costs. The ground they defended had no great resources or cities, only fields and small villages buried in snow, and still it was declared essential, binding them to a position that seemed more trap than shield. Among German officers, a quiet unease spread like a shadow across daily routines. Letters to families spoke of the cold and of longing, but between trusted comrades there were whispers of darker worries. Some recalled the fate of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, less than 14 months before, where encirclement had ended in disaster. That memory lingered heavily, an unspoken reminder of what could happen when withdrawal was denied. Manstein, the field marshal commanding in the south, urged caution and flexibility, seeking freedom to maneuver before it was too late. Yet his advice was diluted as it moved upward, reshaped by Hitler's will into orders of defiance and holding ground. The men in the field sensed the growing danger, though they carried out their duties with weary discipline. Trenches were reinforced, ammunition stored, and patrols sent out, but little could change the imbalance of strength. Officers walked the lines, nodding encouragement, even as their eyes betrayed thoughts they could not say aloud. And in that tension the Steppe seemed to wait with them, aware of the fragility of their position. Hitler's voice echoed across the front, through orders delivered with unyielding certainty. He believed that ground lost could never be regained, that every village abandoned was a step toward defeat. To him, withdrawal was weakness, and strength lay in holding firm, no matter the odds or the cost. His obsession with territory transformed the front into a series of rigid lines, where soldiers were commanded to stand fast rather than maneuver. Generals who had once moved fluidly across the battlefield now found themselves bound by directives that denied flexibility. At headquarters, frustration simmered beneath the surface, but few dared to challenge the Führer's insistence. Manstein argued that mobile defense could save the army, trading space for time, but his words carried little weight against Hitler's authority. To those in the salient, the orders were clear and unbending, even if they carried the seeds of destruction. The gap between the reality of the field and the visions of Berlin widened with every passing day, and through that gap, the inevitability of encirclement began to slip quietly into place. The soldiers who filled the trenches of the salient felt this unease in subtle ways. Their rations grew thinner, their equipment more worn, and their patrols stretched farther across the snow. Mail from home carried words of hope, but also quiet acknowledgement of hardship, as families faced their own struggles far away. The men smoked cigarettes in the cold air, watching the horizon with eyes dulled by routine yet sharpened by instinct. They noticed the faint signs of Soviet activity, the distant sound of engines, the faint glow of fires on the horizon, the silence where silence was unusual. Each day seemed the same, yet beneath the sameness lurked a sense of something moving just out of sight. Officers reassured them with words of strength, but the men trusted more in their senses than in speeches. They spoke quietly of rumors, of larger armies gathering beyond their view. The stillness of the steppe carried more weight than reassurance could lighten, and in that stillness a sense of dread grew steadily, as if the snow itself knew what lay ahead. To the east, Soviet forces were not only preparing, but also watching closely. Their reconnaissance flights traced the outline of the salient, marking its weaknesses with precision. Partisan networks moved through forests and villages, carrying messages and guiding eyes to where the German defenses were thinnest. Soviet commanders knew the bulge invited attack, its shape almost begging to be cut off and sealed. The Red Army had learned through years of trial and error how to surround and reduce such positions. They had done it before, and with every passing month their confidence grew that they could do it again. The German forces were strong in discipline, but weak in numbers. Their positions stretched too far and supported too thinly. To the Soviets, the salient was less a fortress than an offering, one that required only timing and coordination. Their preparations continued quietly, shielded by snow and distance, while the Germans held their lines unaware of the full design. And as days shortened, the sense of approaching collision rippled through the frozen air. Within German headquarters, reports painted a troubling picture that no optimism could erase. Intelligence officers spoke of Soviet troop movements, of new units appearing along the front, of artillery and tanks massing beyond the horizon. Some commanders urged withdrawal before the trap could be sprung, but their words were met with silence or rejection. Hitler's obsession with the map, with its colored lines and bulges, blinded him to the vulnerability those shapes revealed. To him, retreat meant weakness, and weakness meant betrayal of the war effort itself. He ordered the salient held, calling it vital to the stability of the southern front. Generals who knew better obeyed reluctantly, aware that disobedience carried its own consequences. Their thoughts turned inward, weighing loyalty against survival, but for now they complied. The pocket remained fragile and waiting, its defenders bound by orders as rigid as the frozen ground beneath them, and in the quiet halls of command, the decision sealed the fate of thousands without a word of protest. The land itself seemed to echo the precariousness of the moment. Snow lay heavy across roofs and fields, softening the hard shapes of trenches and roads. The rivers ran slow beneath layers of ice, as though time itself had slowed with the water. Yet beneath the surface currents moved unseen, just as armies prepared beyond the horizon. Villages stood half empty, their people carrying on with quiet endurance, caught between forces they could not resist. Smoke rose gently into the pale air, marking where life persisted against the cold. To those who lived there, the war had become a season of its own, one that returned again and again, reshaping everything it touched. The stillness of winter gave no hint of when change would arrive, only that it would come. Nature wrapped the land in silence, but it could not erase the tensions buried beneath it, and so the landscape held its breath, reflecting the fragility of armies stretched too thin across its breadth. In the final days of January, the weight of waiting grew almost heavier than the threat itself. Soldiers tightened belts, officers scanned maps, and villagers watched the horizon with wary eyes. Everyone sensed that the quiet could not last, that it was only the pause before a larger movement began. German defenses held firm on paper, but in reality they were brittle, strained, and stretched to breaking. The salient was no fortress, but a hollow shape waiting to be closed upon itself. Orders kept men rooted to the snow, yet orders could not erase the knowledge of danger. Hope rested on relief that might never come, on the belief that stubbornness could replace strength. In the silence of those days, fate seemed to move slowly, almost invisibly, toward its conclusion. What had begun as a defensive position now felt more like a snare, and as February approached, the steppe seemed to lean quietly toward the storm, gathering in the east. Across the steppe, two armies faced one another in silence, separated by distance, yet bound by the inevitability of conflict. On one side, the Red Army gathered strength with patience and care, its preparations hidden beneath the folds of winter. On the other, the Wehrmacht clung to its trenches and villages, trying to stretch its dwindling resources across a front too long to hold. The Soviets were confident now, their officers certain of momentum gained, since Kursk, their soldiers hardened by years of bitter struggle. The Germans were weary, their optimism faded. their courage now tempered by resignation more than hope. Between them lay snowbound fields and frozen rivers, empty spaces where no man lingered for long. Yet both armies knew these empty spaces would soon become places of movement and decision. Their soldiers thought of home, their officers thought of maps, and the land seemed to think of nothing at all. The two forces mirrored one another, like shadows on ice, dark shapes sliding toward collision. And in the stillness, one could almost feel the weight of their approach drawing steadily closer. For the Soviets, preparation was a discipline as much as a strategy, carried out with a calm that masked determination. Trains delivered tanks from distant factories, their steel bodies gleaming faintly beneath layers of frost. Artillery pieces were wheeled into hidden positions, their barrels raised toward the sky in silent anticipation. Horses pulled wagons, laden with shells along narrow roads, leaving deep ruts that froze in the night. Infantrymen dug shelters in the snow, building fires that glowed softly in the darkness. Partisan messengers arrived at command posts with reports of German movements, offering intelligence gathered at great risk. Soviet commanders studied their maps with steady hands, measuring the distances that would soon be crossed. Orders were given with quiet authority, carrying the assurance that this time the encirclement would hold. Every movement, though small, was part of a larger rhythm, a vast army breathing as one, and in that rhythm, the promise of an inevitable strike began to take shape. The German soldiers saw little of these preparations, but they sensed them in the silence that hung heavy on the horizon. They dug into the frozen ground, reinforcing trenches with logs and snow, making shelters as best they could. In villages, barns were turned into barracks, with straw spread for sleeping and fires burning low for warmth. Watches were long and monotonous, hours spent scanning empty fields where nothing stirred. Supplies arrived in irregular convoys, often too little to ease the gnawing needs of men and animals alike. Commanders encouraged routine drills, believing discipline might compensate for the weariness that weighed on every face. Soldiers mended boots with string, patched uniforms with scraps, and smoked their last cigarettes slowly, as if time itself could be stretched. The men no longer dreamed of quick victory, but of enduring until the winter passed, and with it perhaps a measure of relief. Their laughter was quiet, their songs subdued, as though joy itself had grown cautious, and in their cautiousness they became the mirror image of a force waiting to be struck. The difference between the two armies was not only in numbers or supplies, but in spirit. The Soviets moved with the energy of an army on the rise, their confidence tempered by hardship but strengthened by belief in victory. The Germans moved with the weight of an army on the defensive, their resolve hardened by duty but weakened by doubt. Each side looked across the steppe with different eyes, seeing either opportunity or danger. For the Red Army, every day of waiting was another day closer to a decisive blow. For the Wehrmacht, every day of waiting was another thread pulled tighter around their fragile position. Officers on both sides tried to mask their fears, but soldiers felt them nonetheless, carried quietly in words unspoken. The wind moved across the land, indifferent to plans or worries, carrying only the sound of silence. Yet even silence can carry meaning when two great forces stand opposed in such proximity. And in that silence, the contrast between rising momentum and fading strength grew ever clearer. Partisans in forests and villages added another layer to this contrast. Moving quietly through the occupied land, they guided Soviet intelligence toward weak points in the German lines, noting where supply depots stood and where patrols grew thin. Farmers offered bread in secret, while children carried messages folded into scraps of cloth. The Germans, aware of the danger, tightened security, but suspicion lingered in every interaction with the local people. Trust was scarce, for occupation had bred resentment, and resentment whispered its own loyalties. Partisan sabotage made small cracks in the German hold, cutting communication lines or derailing a train under cover of night. These actions seemed small in scale, yet they added weight to the larger imbalance between the two armies. For the Soviets, such networks were vital threads in the fabric of preparation, weaving strength from the shadows. For the Germans, they were another reminder that their hold on the land was fragile, and in these fragile exchanges, the quiet inevitability of collapse drew a little nearer. Both sides were bound by the same winter, yet they endured it differently. Soviet soldiers saw hardship as part of progress, each frostbitten march another step toward reclaiming their homeland. German soldiers saw hardship as the cost of holding on, each frozen night another reminder of how far they had fallen since their advance. Fires burned in dugouts and shelters, but warmth could not ease the heaviness of waiting. Letters from home carried the voices of families enduring their own trials, binding men to distant lives they might never see again. Soviet letters spoke of hope, of pride in their struggle, of the belief that the war could end with victory. German letters spoke of longing, of endurance, and of memories of times before the war grew so heavy. Both armies, though enemies, shared the same longing for warmth, rest, and peace. Yet one marched toward that vision, while the other clung to it with fading strength. And in the sharp cold of January nights, this difference weighed upon the silence itself. The shape of the salient was like a wound on the map, a bulge that neither side could ignore. For the Germans it was a position to defend, a place where orders bound them more tightly than sense allowed. For the Soviets, it was an opportunity, a chance to cut deep and trap entire divisions in one movement. Both armies studied the same lines, but with opposite intentions, one seeking to preserve, the other to destroy. Officers on both sides marked villages and rivers as points of importance, each feature a small note in the coming symphony of battle. Yet for now, these places were quiet, filled with smoke from chimneys and the sound of footsteps in snow. To the people who lived there, the map meant little, only that war once again pressed upon their homes. Soldiers billeted in barns slept uneasily, their rest broken by the knowledge that peace was temporary. Nothing moved without meaning, and every silence carried the echo of something about to come. And in the lines of the map, the pocket already seemed to exist, waiting only for closure. As January waned, the contrast between the two forces settled into a kind of stillness, fragile yet undeniable. The Soviets prepared without haste, their strength growing steadily behind the curtain of snow. The Germans held without hope of reinforcement, their strength stretched thinner with every passing day. The people of Ukraine endured between them, bearing witness to two armies that moved like tides, inevitable and vast. The frozen rivers gleamed faintly beneath the pale sun, marking boundaries that would soon be crossed. The days were short, the nights long, and in both armies men wondered when the waiting would end. Yet the answer lay not in the present, but in the plans already in motion, plans that would soon transform the silence. Each side, in its own way, lived in the shadow of what was to come. And as February drew near, those shadows lengthened across the snow. The calm endured, but beneath it, the first quiet stirrings of collision could already be felt. The frost lay heavy upon the Ukrainian earth, each blade of grass sealed in ice, each tree outlined in white silence. It was in this frozen world that the Soviet High Command set their thoughts to calculation. Maps spread wide beneath the glow of lanterns. General Vatutin of the 1st Ukrainian Front studied the arcs of his intended strikes, noting where rivers and frozen ground could aid or hinder movement. Beside him, General Konev of the Second Ukrainian Front weighed the strength of artillery and armor, calculating the rhythm of fire that would break the German defenses. They spoke little, their words precise, their intent sharpened by months of pushing westward. To them, the land was not still but alive with possibility, waiting to be shaped by maneuvers that would trap the enemy. The Germans held a bulge of territory that jutted dangerously, and to Soviet eyes it was a floor waiting to be sealed. Around tables in frost-covered huts, these plans gathered shape like ice, forming slowly on a river. What seemed a winter pause to soldiers at the front was to their commanders only a quiet mask before motion. And in that mask of silence, decisions were being made that would soon ripple across the steppes. The Germans, meanwhile, looked at the same land and saw only the weight of survival pressing down on every position. Reports moved upward, carrying warnings of Soviet strength, of massing artillery, of movements that felt too deliberate to be random. Yet within Hitler's headquarters, the shape of danger was blurred by obsession with holding each kilometer, no matter the strain. Field marshals and generals in the field pleaded for flexibility, for withdrawal from the vulnerable bulge, but their voices often met silence or reprimand. To the German high command, every step backward was betrayal, and every foothold lost was intolerable. Thus divisions remained stretched thin across a front that bent like brittle glass beneath winter weight. Villages that had once been refuges became fragile outposts, their chimneys smoking weakly as soldiers dug in deeper against the cold. The warnings of encirclement seemed far away, drowned in the insistence of orders from above. For men in trenches and frozen farmhouses, the war seemed locked in stasis, though unease stirred just below the frost. That unease would grow as invisible plans solidified in the distance. On Soviet maps, red arrows swept wide, curving with an elegance that belied the harsh labor required to bring them to life. Infantry, artillery, armor, and air support were being aligned in patterns designed to close like a jaw upon the German bulge. Konev's armies prepared from the south, Vatutin's from the north, and between them lay Korsun, a name that would soon carry the weight of entrapment. The planners thought not only of battle but of timing, of how the winter ground would hold up under the treads of tanks, of how the frozen rivers could serve as roads rather than barriers. Partisan reports fed into these calculations, whispers of German positions gathered in barns and forests, carried eastward with patient hands. Everything seemed part of a larger rhythm, as though the frost itself lent its quiet to the deliberations. Few outside the circle of planners understood how close the Germans were to being cut off. Even the soldiers who would carry rifles and shells into battle felt only the restless pause before orders came. The calm hid intent, and that intent was tightening like ice in the cracks of stone. The board was set, but only one side saw the full game. The air itself seemed to hold the secret clear and biting, as if reluctant to disturb what was gathering below. German reconnaissance flights reported concentrations of troops, but in the haze of winter it was difficult to judge scale or intent. Commanders at the front wondered if these were preparations for another broad push westward, or merely the pressure of attrition that had become so familiar. In Berlin and at headquarters, the warnings blurred into routine, and routine dulled urgency. Soldiers held their ground with stoic discipline, unaware that their positions were already mapped as prey. In frost-covered meadows, guns were hidden beneath camouflage, while tanks were readied in silent rows, exhaust plumes, ghosting upward in the dawn. The Soviets knew the patience of waiting, letting the frost harden roads before launching steel into motion. The Germans, in contrast, clung to belief that winter might bring reprieve, that the storm had spent itself. Yet beneath their feet, the frost was not a pause, but a preparation. Soon the land itself would shudder with movement. Hitler's refusal to bend strategy hung like a shadow over the German commanders on the ground. Many of them could read the danger in their maps, but their hands were bound by directives that demanded holding every line, every bend in the river, every cluster of huts. This rigidity was more than military, it was ideological, a belief that no ground could be surrendered without consequence. In meetings, voices grew strained as officers argued for prudence, only to be reminded of the Führer's orders. Soldiers at the front heard only fragments of this debate, yet they felt its weight in their daily routines. The bulge became a prison of loyalty, with no room to maneuver, no chance to retreat. Each village became a nail hammered into position, holding them in place even as the ice thickened around them. To fight the Soviet tide required movement, yet movement was forbidden. The paradox was clear to those who cared to see, though clarity was not enough to alter fate, and so the lines held waiting for a strike they could not prevent. For the Soviets there was a different kind of pressure, the demand to coordinate vast armies with precision. Vatutin and Konev were not always in harmony, for each front had its pride, and each commander his style. Yet the goal of encirclement united them, for here was a chance to deliver a blow that echoed the triumph of Stalingrad. Encirclements had become the symbol of Soviet strategy, a way to destroy not only divisions but the confidence of the enemy. Meetings were long, orders careful, supply routes considered with a patience shaped by hard lessons. Stalin expected results, but his generals knew that haste could unravel what frost had preserved. So they balanced urgency with caution, aligning the rhythm of men and machines with the rhythm of the season. Every hour brought adjustments, every day a refinement of the arc that would close upon Korsun. It was not yet a battle, but already the framework of one was being woven. The frost was their ally, their shield, and their measure of time. Meanwhile, the land itself remained quiet, a vastness indifferent to the plans unfolding upon it. Snow-muffled sound, making villages appear like islands adrift in a sea of white. Horses stamped at frozen ground, breath steaming in the cold, while men wrapped themselves deeper in coats and silence. Somewhere in that silence, the two armies coexisted in uneasy parallel, each aware of the other, but blind to full intent. Farmers who still clung to their homes watched movements with weary eyes, knowing that the land had become the stage for forces far greater than themselves. To them the soldiers of both sides seemed like shadows passing through, leaving only churned fields and broken fences behind. Yet even they sensed something heavy in the air, a weight that did not come only from snow. The quiet was too deep, the stillness too deliberate. It was the kind of calm that never lasts, and those who lived long on the steppe understood what silence often meant. The frost held its breath as January crept forward, and in that breath the plans were sealed. Red arrows on maps were translated into columns of men and machines, still hidden but ready. German positions, outwardly unchanged, sat like figures awaiting a curtain to rise. The commanders who sensed danger could only watch as days slipped by, their warnings buried beneath command that allowed no change. Soviet commanders, in contrast, felt the closeness of opportunity, as though the land itself urged them to strike. Between these two realities, the balance shifted silently, invisible to those at rest in the trenches. What had seemed a pause was in fact a gathering, like clouds assembling on a horizon. Soon the first rumble would break the stillness, and the waiting would end. But for now the frost remained unbroken, concealing the storm it was about to deliver. And in that concealment, both hope and dread continued to grow. On the morning of January 24th, 1944, the steppe seemed to hold its breath, aware of the movement rippling beneath the frost. The Soviet offensive began quietly with artillery thunder rolling through the frozen fields, shaking the air in low distant waves. Columns of tanks crept forward, their treads churning the snow into grey ribbons of motion. Infantry followed behind, steady and deliberate, each step measured against the cold and the stretch of land ahead. German soldiers in the salient sensed a shift, the first tremors of something inevitable, reaching them through the frozen silence. Reports moved quickly along the lines, positions tested, defenses strained, and small towns under pressure. Commanders barked orders, yet many men could only brace, waiting for the changes that seemed already written in the frost. Villages that had been quiet for months now felt the pulse of conflict, their walls shuddering under distant impacts. The land itself seemed to shiver with the passing of steel and snow, and in that shiver, the first lines of the pocket began to take shape. The Germans responded with disciplined precision, yet their strength could not match the orchestration of the Soviet advance. Machine guns opened in measured bursts, covering retreating infantry, while officers guided men from dugouts to secondary lines. Supplies were carried forward under strain, and medics moved carefully, tending the few who were caught in harsh conditions. Horses stamped nervously in the snow, their breath curling in thin clouds that mingled with the morning haze. Soldiers felt the weight of winter heavy on their shoulders and boots, as they faced a tide that seemed to press against them from every side. The air smelled faintly of smoke and damp earth, the quiet punctuated by the distant rhythm of engines. Even as resistance held in small pockets, the overall front began to curve, bending under invisible hands. Each day of January brought new pressure, and the steppe itself seemed to lean toward the advancing forces. The Germans moved like shadows, trying to hold shape in a wind, aware that the ground beneath was no longer firm. And beneath all, the sense of encirclement began to whisper with growing clarity. Soviet commanders guided their forces with deliberate care, timing each movement to exploit weakness and frost alike. Armored units pressed along frozen roads, while infantry circled through forests and across meadows, unseen and steady. Artillery rumbled intermittently, sending echoes across the expanse that carried both warning and reassurance to those who waited. Reconnaissance units moved in silence, confirming gaps in German lines and noting the smallest signs of vulnerability. Logistics officers ensured supply convoys moved along tracks, hardened by winter, providing shells, food, and warmth to those at the tip of the strike. Orders were simple but precise, every unit aware that coordination was the key to closing the pocket. The rhythm of advance was steady, like the flow of a river beneath ice, quiet but unstoppable. Soldiers felt the rhythm beneath their boots, in the vibration of engines and the whisper of snow under tread. The front began to ripple, folds of land shifting gently yet irreversibly, and in that ripple, the shadow of the German bulge seemed to lean inward, as if sensing the pressure it could not resist. Villages along the front became brief theaters of movement, quiet homes now hosting the flow of men and machines. Smoke rose slowly from chimneys and fires, mingling with the mist that hung low over frozen fields. Soldiers passed through cautiously, taking what cover the buildings offered, and moving on before daylight fully broke. The snow bore the marks of countless boots and treads, a pale testimony to the invisible choreography unfolding. For the civilians who remained, there was a sense of displacement, of waiting beneath layers of frost, for events that seemed both near and unreal. Dogs padded along paths, ears twitching at sounds too faint for human attention. Trees shivered under the weight of ice, their branches like fingers pointing toward the direction of movement. The quiet was fragile, punctuated by the distant pulse of artillery and engines. Even the wind seemed careful, moving softly across the open fields, carrying neither scent nor promise. And in that softness the tension of January deepened, shaping the rhythm of the coming pocket. Inside the German lines, soldiers adjusted to the sudden pressure, their discipline steady but their minds alert. Officers directed men from trenches to secondary positions, eyes scanning the horizon for any hint of a breakthrough. Ammunition was distributed sparingly, rations carried cautiously across frozen paths, fires burned low in dugouts, and the smell of smoke mixed with the damp cold of the earth. Horses tethered to supply wagons huddled together, their warmth offering a small comfort to the men nearby. Patrols moved farther afield, ears straining for signs of movement beneath the snow. Even the simplest tasks carried weight, each step measured against the possibility of sudden engagement. The men spoke quietly among themselves, voices low with a shared sense of anticipation. Though orders were clear, each soldier felt the subtle shift in rhythm, the air vibrating with forces they could not see fully, and in that vibration, the front itself began to curve toward the inevitable. Soviet intelligence guided the offensive with careful precision, anticipating German movements with a quiet confidence. Partisans in forests relayed positions and weaknesses, their reports folded into the greater design of encirclement. Artillery units adjusted fire as gaps appeared, sending patterns of sound across villages and fields. Tanks moved like silent tides, following roads and frozen rivers, while infantry supported them with steady, unseen steps. Generals calculated the angles of attack, aware that the window for encirclement was brief and exacting. Orders traveled swiftly, and every man at the front felt the weight of collective motion. Communication lines hummed faintly, their signals lost to the snow, but carrying crucial guidance. The German bulge, once a static shape on maps, began to bend and narrow as Soviet pressure grew. The pace quickened imperceptibly, yet with every movement, the framework of the pocket solidified, and in the quiet that followed each advance, the land seemed to acknowledge the coming compression. By the afternoon, the first signs of the pocket's edges were visible, subtle yet undeniable. The German front had begun to buckle, small detachments withdrawing to maintain cohesion, while the land shifted under them. Villages that had been points of defense now marked the outer limits of pressure, quiet indicators of the shape forming across the steppe. Soldiers moved with care, measuring every step against both frost and advancing columns. The snow bore the tracks of movement, weaving patterns that traced the flow of men and machines. Officers watched their maps with growing awareness, noting how the front itself curved under unseen hands. Winds whispered across frozen fields, brushing against the edges of trenches and supply lines alike. Even in retreat, the Germans maintained their rhythm, their discipline shaping the pace of withdrawal, and within this rhythm, the pocket began to emerge, its boundaries defined by anticipation as much as by action. The first crack had become a shape, quiet but inexorable. As night fell, the steppe seemed to exhale, a soft wind rustling over frozen fields and hollow villages. The offensive paused as all armies do when darkness gathers, yet its effect lingered in the trembling of the front. The Soviets consolidated gains, infantry and armor taking positions that would continue to press inward. German units regrouped where they could, their lines stretched but still connected. Though the sense of being enclosed grew, smoke from small fires mingled with mist, carrying faint scents of warmth, earth and wood. Soldiers on both sides listened to the wind, aware that silence could carry as much meaning as sound. Orders traveled through the night, guiding movements that would continue with the first light. The pocket, invisible in the day, became palpable under the quiet sky. Stars reflected off the ice like distant witnesses, indifferent yet constant, and beneath their cold light the steppe held the promise of motion that would continue tomorrow. The first days of January's strike had transformed the landscape into something both familiar and altered. Snowfields now carried tracks of armies, villages became silent markers of shifting lines, and rivers marked the curves of encirclement yet to close. Soldiers on both sides felt the subtle pressure of history pressing beneath their boots. Officers traced maps by candlelight, noting changes with quiet focus, aware that each decision rippled far beyond the immediate horizon. Horses stamped softly in the snow. Soldiers paused to listen to the frost settling beneath their feet. The front had shifted, bending under forces long planned, yet no moment of catastrophe had yet arrived. Everything seemed at once fragile and permanent, a balance that trembled with anticipation, and in that tremble the shape of the pocket solidified, quiet and inevitable. Tomorrow would bring new steps, and the rhythm of encirclement would continue to unfold. And so the frozen land held its breath, waiting for the next motion of winter's advance. The frost of the steppe seemed to deepen as German soldiers slowly realized that the front they had held was no longer continuous. Reports came in piece by piece, each one a quiet confirmation of what had long been feared. 6 divisions, including elite units of the Waffen-SS and Wehrmacht, found themselves surrounded, their positions isolated by rivers, forests, and advancing Soviet lines. At first disbelief lingered, a fragile shield against the reality of encirclement. Officers examined maps with furrowed brows, tracing the edges of the pocket that now pressed inward from all sides. Messages to headquarters carried both hope and desperation, often unanswered or delayed. In villages, civilians who had stayed behind sensed the change, their quiet routines interrupted by the movement of soldiers and the distant pulse of engines. Snow fell steadily, covering tracks that might have offered clues, concealing paths that could have led outward. The world felt smaller, the horizon compressed by invisible hands. And in this compression, the air itself seemed to thicken with the weight of inevitable confinement. The psychological shift among the German troops was subtle, but unmistakable. Denial gave way to a quiet tension, a hum beneath conversations and routines. Soldiers spoke less of victory and more of endurance, of lasting through days that seemed to stretch longer than winter itself. Officers moved through trenches with measured steps, eyes scanning beyond the immediate, the encircling lines they could not break. Orders remained the same: hold, resist, survive, but their meaning shifted from proactive defense to passive preservation. In barns and dugouts, men paused to listen to distant movements, tracing the rhythm of the Red Army in their minds. Horses in stables stamped softly, their breath mingling with smoke and the scent of wood and earth. The cold pressed into every corner, emphasizing the quiet vulnerability of those trapped within. Even routine tasks carried the weight of awareness, each movement a reminder of boundaries that could not be crossed. And through it all, a shared realization spread like frost along the trenches. The pocket was real, and it was closing. Civilians trapped within the pocket shared in the tension, their presence adding a layer of human fragility to the frozen landscape. Families huddled together in houses pressed close against the cold, listening to the distant rumble of tanks and artillery. Their days were filled with small tasks, gathering firewood, preparing meals, keeping children warm. But even these were punctuated by uncertainty. Every sound from the steppe carried significance. A distant thump might be the approach of a convoy, or the movement of a larger column. People whispered of soldiers moving through their villages, noting changes in uniforms and accents that hinted at desperation. The weight of snow seemed heavier when the world beyond the home felt confined and inescapable. Even animals sensed the tension. their movements cautious and deliberate, as if the frost itself warned them of unseen forces. Children slept more fitfully, waking to sounds their parents could barely explain. The quiet of winter was no longer comforting. It carried an echo of unease, and beneath that echo the encirclement touched every life, shaping a shared experience of constraint and vigilance. Commanders within the pocket worked to preserve order and morale, even as their options narrowed. Meetings were held in dimly lit rooms, with maps spread across tables and hands tracing lines that led nowhere but inward. Words were chosen carefully, balancing the need for discipline with the recognition of mounting peril. Soldiers listened, taking comfort in routine, in the cadence of orders, and the assurance of structure. Yet beneath these reassurances, the shape of their confinement pressed like a soft weight against consciousness. Each day, scouts reported gaps that had once seemed vast, now reduced to narrow corridors by the inexorable advance of Soviet forces. Officers tried to maintain optimism, speaking of relief that might yet arrive, yet their faces betrayed the strain of impossibility. Rations were calculated more carefully, ammunition distributed with precision, every act measured against the constraint of encirclement. Even small gestures, a shared cup of tea, a warm blanket, became rituals of resilience, and in these quiet acts, soldiers and civilians alike sought to soften the edges of their confinement. The snow-covered land itself seemed to accentuate the sense of entrapment, stretching wide yet offering no escape. Roads disappeared under white layers, tracks erased, as if the land sought to keep secrets. Frozen rivers formed barriers where once movement might have been possible, their surfaces deceptive in hardness and depth. Forests stood like silent witnesses, their bare branches etched against grey skies, observing the compression of men and animals alike. Smoke from fires curled gently, carrying the faint scent of wood and warmth, yet also marking positions and signaling to distant eyes. Wind carried whispers of movement, soft enough to be mistaken for nothing, yet enough to remind those inside of the larger world pressing inward. Villages seemed smaller, the space between structures compressed under the weight of snow and awareness. Every morning revealed the extent of isolation, the distance to the nearest line of friendly forces. Stretching further, soldiers measured each horizon with care, aware that each glance outward confirmed confinement. And in that measured gaze, the full shape of encirclement settled quietly into mind and body alike. Psychologically, the pocket created a rhythm all its own, subtle yet unrelenting. The ebb and flow of duties, guarding, repairing, marching short distances, distributing supplies, took on a hypnotic cadence. Soldiers and civilians alike found themselves responding to the same cues, distant sounds, the lengthening of shadows, the temperature of air pressed close by frost. Time became more fluid, measured not by hours but by small acts of necessity and observation. Letters written to family carried a mixture of mundane detail and careful understatement, attempts to anchor oneself to a world beyond the snow. Officers read them silently, aware that they might never reach their destinations. Conversations around fires were soft, careful, circumspect, carrying both camaraderie and tension in equal measure. The rhythm of survival became its own form of meditation, a way to endure the immobility imposed by encirclement, and in that meditation, the mind shaped the quiet resilience that would carry men and women through the frozen days ahead. Outside the pocket, Soviet forces pressed their advantage with patient precision, closing the outer edges while avoiding unnecessary exposure. Scouts reported German movements and gaps, feeding a larger design that had been carefully planned for weeks. Artillery units shifted to match the curves of the encirclement. Their presence felt more as pressure than sudden impact, Infantry advanced in careful coordination, the rhythm of boots and treads, folding the German positions inward. Every maneuver was measured, almost imperceptible, yet cumulatively decisive, forming the walls of a trap that could not easily be escaped. Even the frost seemed to participate, hardening roads for tanks and compressing snow beneath advancing feet. The German soldiers, though unaware of the full scale, felt the tightening indirectly in smaller engagements, missed reinforcements, and the narrowing of movement. Civilians sensed it as well, watching from windows and doorways as the world seemed to shrink around them. And in the quiet of the encirclement, the sense of inevitability deepened, as if the winter itself had drawn a line that could not be crossed. As evening fell, the pocket settled into a tense lull. Fragile but undeniable, fires burned low in huts and dugouts, casting warmth against the cold yet leaving shadows to linger. Soldiers and civilians alike huddled near one another, sharing moments of quiet and remembrance to soften the edges of isolation. Even in stillness, every sound carried meaning: the creak of timber, the sigh of wind, the distant hum of engines. Officers moved through positions deliberately, speaking softly, maintaining routines that bound the pocket together. The frost seemed to settle more heavily, a tactile reminder of the confinement pressing on all within. Horses and dogs rested in barns, their bodies close for warmth, mirroring the need for human connection. Letters were written, whispers exchanged, and the rhythm of survival became a collective heartbeat. And as night deepened over the snow, the pocket itself seemed to breathe, a living shape held together by both endurance and quiet despair. The world outside could wait for now. All within the encirclement existed in fragile, frozen suspense. Within the encirclement, winter pressed down with increasing weight, shaping every moment of life inside the cauldron. Soldiers moved cautiously over frozen earth, each step deliberate, each breath rising in visible clouds before fading into the cold. Bread had long grown scarce, baked in small, hard loaves that offered little warmth or comfort. Horses, once companions and laborers, now became a resource, their flesh rationed under strict orders. Ammunition dwindled quietly, the clatter of rounds a constant reminder of limitations. Artillery fire from beyond the pocket hummed relentlessly, shaking houses, trees, and the resolve of men alike. Communications with Berlin became urgent, radios crackling with pleas for reinforcements, supplies, and guidance that rarely arrived. Officers maintained discipline with quiet authority, balancing the weight of necessity and the shrinking morale of their men. Snow pressed against walls and roofs, its whiteness betraying the fragility of what little protection remained. And in the hush that followed each distant boom, the soldiers felt the steady squeeze of winter and circumstance closing around them. Morning brought no relief, only the continuation of the subtle pressure that defined every hour. Soldiers unwrapped frozen rations, chewing in silence, their thoughts elsewhere, far beyond the boundaries of the pocket. Fires burned low in trenches and huts, the smell of smoke mixing with the earthy scent of frost-hardened soil. Horses huddled together, their warmth shared among soldiers who paused briefly to rest hands or lean for comfort. Ammunition belts were distributed with care, each round accounted for, as though it were a precious commodity of life itself. Messages carried from forward posts detailed movements of the encroaching Red Army, distant yet unceasing. Officers circled positions, offering guidance in soft tones, their faces lined with weariness that the frost could not soothe. The wind moved across open fields with a subtle rhythm, brushing snow into tiny drifts that marked paths long traveled. Even in these small tasks, the soldiers found a fragile rhythm, a quiet cadence to hold the day together. And beneath it all, the pressure of encirclement remained, like frost pressing into the very marrow of the land. Civilians within the pocket adjusted in their own quiet ways, sharing warmth and sustenance where possible. Children huddled under blankets, their breath mingling with that of parents, in cold rooms that offered little insulation. Meals were small and deliberate, the sharing of each morsel, both practical and ceremonial. Stories of distant life beyond the encirclement were whispered softly, offering comfort that the world continued elsewhere. Windows framed landscapes of white, unbroken yet alive with distant movement, and every sound carried a weight of meaning. Smoke rose from meager fires curling slowly into the grey sky, signaling life and endurance against the quiet pressure outside. Animals, though fewer and weaker with each passing day, were tended carefully, their presence offering solace to men and women alike. Every gesture became a ritual of resilience, each breath measured against the cold and the encircling threat. The snow seemed to gather around homes and trenches alike, uniting them in isolation. And in this isolation, the fragile bonds of survival deepened, quiet but unbroken. Outside, Soviet artillery moved with a rhythm that was both predictable and inevitable. Each shell a note in a larger composition. Barrages shook the ground and reverberated through walls, sending tremors beneath boots and into hearts. Soldiers learned to anticipate the subtle hum before impact, adjusting position, breathing slowly, and waiting for the pattern to pass. Supplies shifted forward along hidden routes, their arrival measured in hours and precious for the few who received them. Reports moved back to command posts, detailing resistance, movement, and the effectiveness of containment. Even in the noise, there was a strange order, a cadence that allowed men to anticipate without panic. Officers mapped each effect carefully, weighing terrain, morale, and the rhythm of engagement in every decision. Horses and men alike seemed to sense the steady pulse, moving with quiet acknowledgement of the forces pressing inward. The world outside the pocket followed its own clock, relentless yet measured. And in the echo of artillery across frozen fields, the grip of encirclement tightened imperceptibly. Inside, soldiers grew attuned to scarcity, each small act magnified in importance. Water melted over slow fires, the steam a fragile comfort in frozen air. Supplies were portioned, rations stretched, and the necessity of sharing underscored every interaction. Ammunition counts dictated tactics, shaping movement and restraint, a quiet intelligence guiding each small maneuver. Officers reinforced routine, recognizing that structure alone could ease anxiety, even as pressure mounted. Quiet conversations took place near fires, murmurs of home and memory that lent warmth to cold hands. Trenches and shelters became more than protection. They were temporary havens, small bastions against both winter and the encroaching threat. Snow fell steadily outside, blanketing the land in white silence that carried no reassurance. Every day reinforced the sense that survival was a measured act, precise, patient, and unending. And in that measurement the soldiers found a slow rhythm, a fragile cadence to meet the tightening day. Radios crackled with increasing urgency. The messages to Berlin, a blend of routine report and quiet desperation. Pleas for reinforcements, food and ammunition grew more insistent, yet responses arrived sporadically or not at all. Officers translated static into hope, passing words for indications of aid that rarely materialized. Soldiers listened, their faces stoic, yet their eyes betrayed the weight of isolation. Every beep, every voice carried the echo of a world distant yet essential. Horses shifted in stalls, their bodies leaning against human companions, providing warmth and companionship. Snowdrifts pressed against doors, signaling both the beauty and constraint of winter. Fires burned steadily, the flicker of flame a measure of resilience amid scarcity. Even as desperation grew quietly in corners of the pocket, discipline and routine maintained a rhythm that lent a fragile continuity to life. And in that rhythm, men clung to hope, slow and steady as frost forming over frozen earth. As days lengthened, the pattern of siege became both predictable and unrelenting. Shells fell at intervals that were at once random and familiar, shaping movement and expectation alike. Soldiers learned to walk softly, speak softly, and move with measured care. Meals and rations, though meager, were observed with reverence, each small act a reassurance against the pressure outside. Civilians continued to share warmth, stories, and shelter. Where possible, their resilience mirrored in the quiet of the trenches. Snow covered tracks and paths, leaving only memory and instinct to guide movement. The wind carried distant sounds, almost whispers, hinting at the relentless orchestration of forces beyond. Every day was marked by calculation, patience, and observation, the rhythm of survival shaping thought and action. And in the hush between each distant rumble, the grip of the cauldron became tangible, a silent pressure felt in bone and breath alike. By nightfall, the pocket seemed to settle into a fragile, tense lull. Fires burned low, smoke rising in steady ribbons into grey skies. Soldiers shared quiet moments, whispering memories, dreams, and small comforts against the cold. Horses and dogs rested near men, warmth shared in fragile intimacy. Radios remained open, voices crackling with faint hope, even as replies failed to arrive. Ammunition and rations were accounted for with care. Every act weighted with the importance of tomorrow. The frost settled heavily, blanketing the pocket in white quiet that pressed against all it touched. Even in sleep the soldiers dreamed lightly, of movement, of escape, of home, tempered by the rhythm of the encirclement. And in that quiet night, the world seemed suspended, held between the hammer of artillery and the fragile endurance of those inside. The cauldron tightened, slowly, inexorably, yet life persisted, measured in frost and breath. The winter landscape seemed indifferent to the human drama unfolding upon it. Yet every officer within the pocket felt the shadow of decisions made far away. Hitler's orders had fixed the German divisions into a rigid posture, insisting that the bulge be held as a fortress at all costs. The echoes of Stalingrad lingered in the minds of senior commanders, a cautionary tale they could not forget. Manstein, Stemmermann, and their colleagues weighed the lives under their command against the immovable weight of loyalty. Messages flowed to Berlin, outlining the encroaching danger and the need for flexibility, yet responses returned slow and uncompromising. Each decision delayed was a day lost. Each delay felt like frost settling heavier on already strained shoulders. The generals debated quietly, voices lowered not by fear alone, but by the gravity of responsibility. Soldiers in trenches sensed only the immobility, the stillness imposed by orders from afar, and adapted their routines to maintain cohesion. Even the snow seemed thicker here, pressing against trenches and paths, as though echoing the constraints imposed from high command. And in the quiet of winter, the grip of distant authority pressed steadily against the pocket's fragile endurance. Manstein's mind traced every possible maneuver, calculating arcs of escape and relief. Yet the window for movement closed gradually with each passing day. Stemmermann observed his men with quiet pride and concern, balancing discipline with empathy. Officers moved among the ranks, noting weariness in boots and hands, listening to the faint pulse of anxiety beneath calm voices. Reports of Soviet tightening reached headquarters in deliberate detail, emphasizing the pressing rhythm of encirclement. Yet Berlin remained steadfast in its belief that retreat was betrayal. Every argument for flexibility met with silence or reprimand. Supplies already scarce became symbolic of control, measured not only for survival but for compliance. The frost outside pressed against walls, trenches, and roofs, indifferent yet accentuating the human tension within. Even the smallest actions, distributing rations, tending horses, adjusting winter coats, were magnified by the weight of command and circumstance. Soldiers moved with deliberate steps, mindful of orders they could neither question nor ignore. And as the days unfolded, the tension between loyalty and necessity deepened, shaping each breath taken inside the pocket. Inside the pocket, communication lines grew both lifelines and reminders of restriction. Officers transmitted messages upward with careful diction, aware that the weight of words might influence decisions, yet powerless to compel change. Soldiers listened to static-laced transmissions, hearing only the faintest promise of support or guidance. Every beep and crackle carried significance, offering hope or frustration in equal measure. Discipline became both anchor and measure, a quiet ritual to maintain morale amid pressure. Officers circulated quietly, reinforcing routines, smoothing tensions, and reminding men that survival required patience. Snow pressed heavily on roofs and over frozen paths, creating a silent barrier that accentuated the sense of isolation. Even horses and dogs seemed attuned to the human tension, their restlessness, a mirror of anxious minds. The rhythm of day and night was marked by routine and frost, by careful distribution of resources and observation of the horizon. And beneath the surface of obedience, both officers and soldiers felt the pull of the grip that constrained them, unyielding and absolute. Each day brought new, subtle negotiations between survival and command. Manstein considered every possibility for maneuver, tracing arcs of hope that required compliance from a higher authority that refused to bend. Stemmermann balanced vigilance and care, keeping morale steady while listening to the silent pulse of tension among troops. Soldiers executed orders precisely, each step measured in rhythm with both frost and fear, aware that any deviation might bring consequence. Supplies were stretched to their limit, rations distributed with meticulous attention, and even the sharing of blankets carried weight. Snow and wind pressed against buildings and trenches, whispering reminders of confinement and the relentlessness of winter. Communication with Berlin continued, each message a mixture of practical report and quiet appeal. Officers noted the delay in responses, reading gaps and silence, with a tension that never fully lifted. Even as the pocket's edges solidified under Soviet pressure, the human tension inside grew, subtle yet inescapable, and in this silence, the grip of command from afar weighed more heavily than the frost itself. Soldiers adapted quietly to constraints imposed not only by the encirclement, but by rigid orders from above. Drill and routine became both shield and anchor, the cadence of daily life shaping resilience against pressure. Snow packed along trenches and paths, covering marks of movement and erasing traces that might have suggested retreat. Horses and men huddled for warmth, sharing proximity as comfort against both cold and command. Rations were observed with care, each morsel carrying both sustenance and the reminder of dwindling freedom. Officers moved like quiet guardians, balancing enforcement with empathy, aware that morale was as fragile as frost underfoot. The distant rhythm of Soviet artillery provided a constant background, shaping movement and awareness, even as orders dictated restraint. Messages from Berlin remained scarce, yet the weight of authority shaped every decision, measured in both words and silences. And beneath the frost-hardened earth, the pocket's occupants felt the subtle pull of loyalty, discipline, and inevitability, steady as snow accumulating on rooftops. Manstein's reflections carried both hope and melancholy, tracing the edges of opportunity in maps that revealed no easy path. Stemmermann moved among the trenches, quietly noting the strain on faces, the silent question of how long endurance could continue. Soldiers adjusted to scarcity, to isolation, to the quiet insistence of orders they could not question. Horses stamped softly in frozen stables, their warmth shared as a small comfort amid the rigid structure imposed from afar. Snow drifted across open fields, covering paths and hiding marks, a natural echo of the confinement that surrounded them. Messages crackled faintly through radio static, a mixture of instruction and unresolved tension. Routines and rituals became both protection and distraction, small movements offering continuity amid pressure. The winter pressed on every surface, yet the invisible weight of command pressed equally on minds and bodies. And as each day closed, the pocket felt smaller, tighter, and more controlled by distant hands, even as its occupants persisted quietly. The human tension within the cauldron became a rhythm all its own, subtle and continuous. Soldiers rose and fell with the cadence of routine, performing duties and listening to distant echoes that shaped awareness. Officers moved deliberately, reinforcing discipline while observing morale, aware that the smallest gestures mattered as much as strategy. Snow and frost accentuated boundaries, enclosing men, animals, and structures in quiet containment. Messages from Berlin carried authority, shaping every calculation, even when silence or delay tempered their impact. The pocket's edges pressed inward under Soviet orchestration, and every day highlighted the contrast between potential mobility and imposed restraint. Horses shifted their weight against companions, seeking warmth and quiet, mirroring the human need for comfort. Conversations were hushed, stories and memories shared in whispers, both distraction and solace. And in the gentle cadence of survival, the grip from afar continued to shape every thought, every breath, and every step within the frost-bound pocket. As night fell over frozen fields and silent villages, the weight of command settled over the encircled men like a dense snow. Fires burned low, smoke curling into the cold air, the flicker of flame a quiet measure of endurance. Soldiers and officers huddled together, speaking softly, observing routines that tethered them to both safety and hope. Horses and dogs rested nearby, their warmth a fragile comfort against the relentless winter. Radios continued to crackle faintly, voices filtered through static with messages that shaped decisions even in delay. Supplies were accounted for with meticulous care, every ration and round counted as a gesture of continuity. Frost pressed against walls and roofs, a tactile reminder of both confinement and protection. Even in sleep, men dreamed lightly of movement and escape, constrained yet persistent. And as the night deepened, the grip of command from Berlin weighed like invisible ice, steady and unyielding, shaping every heartbeat in the pocket. Tomorrow would come as it always does, carrying both the cold and the mandate of authority forward. Through the drifting snow and frozen mud, General Hube's relief force began its cautious advance, the land itself seeming to slow their passage. Tracks of tanks and vehicles cut through white fields, compressing snow into ribbons that marked determination and strain. Infantry followed, boots crunching softly, their movements deliberate as they navigated the uneven terrain. Orders were issued quietly yet with precision, a rhythm that bound men, machines, and horses into one moving body. Villages, small and scattered, became points of passage, each building offering shelter and temporary reprieve. Soviet fire pressed steadily, distant yet constant, shaping every decision and every pace of advance. Horses shifted beneath blankets of frost, their breath misting into the cold air, adding warmth to tired soldiers. The horizon seemed to stretch endlessly, yet every movement brought them closer to the trapped divisions. Snow fell steadily, muffling sounds and softening the edges of the landscape. And beneath the quiet of winter, the rhythm of the relief force moved forward, measured yet relentless. In the villages along the route, frozen homes became temporary stations, places where supplies were checked and minor repairs undertaken. Officers conferred quietly, tracing maps by the dim glow of lanterns, planning every curve and obstacle. Infantry rested briefly, sharing small rations, their breaths mingling with the scent of firewood and damp earth. Tanks creaked and groaned, their engines steady against the uneven ice and mud. Even the wind seemed subdued, carrying the faint echo of movement, while hiding the progress from distant eyes. Snow drifts pressed against walls and fences, softening the impression of advance, yet marking the path for those who followed. Soldiers listened to the rhythm of engines and distant artillery, their senses attuned to the subtle messages carried in sound. Horses pawed at frozen ground, their soft exhalations mingling with the scent of frost and leather. The pace was slow, deliberate, yet the direction was unbroken, a quiet promise of approach. And in this careful progression, the relief force carried with it both hope and heavy awareness of the distance yet to traverse. The tension between the advancing force and the trapped pocket was a rhythm, felt rather than seen. Radios crackled intermittently, carrying words of encouragement, instructions, and faint promises of coordination. Soldiers in the pocket listened closely, marking each transmission as a measure of time, progress, and uncertainty. Supplies moved forward slowly, each crate and shell a reminder of the life threaded through snow and frost. Officers mapped distances in measured units, aware that the frozen rivers and mud would test both men and machines. Artillery pulses from both sides added a distant rhythm, a quiet pressure that shaped movement and expectation. Even in the snow, the landscape seemed to push back, softening tracks, concealing trails, and demanding persistence. Horses and men shared a tacit understanding, adapting to rhythm and obstacle alike. Every decision carried weight. Each small victory in movement felt like progress, yet the larger challenge remained. And beneath the quiet exertion, both hope and tension grew steadily, shaping every breath and footstep. Across frozen villages, tanks maneuvered with the deliberation of dancers on an icy stage. Their engines hummed, blending with the creak of metal and the soft hiss of exhaust. Infantry moved in tandem, boots crunching and muffled under the steady snow. Horses carried supplies, their warmth, a comfort to men pressed against frost. Officers walked between lines, adjusting formation and rhythm, careful to preserve both momentum and order. Soviet positions pressed gently but persistently, forcing minor deviations and cautious pauses. Every bridge and road required attention, calculations of weight and frost, of mud and hidden ruts. Smoke from fires mingled with the winter air, faintly scented with wood and cold earth. Even small adjustments carried consequence, shaping the movement of the relief as surely as the snow molded the land. And through each deliberate step, the tension of approach continued, measured yet mounting. At night the relief force slowed but did not stop, the rhythm of movement folding into routines of warmth and observation. Soldiers huddled under blankets, sharing quiet conversations and hot tea, the steam rising into frozen air. Horses rested near wagons, shifting gently as men tended to tack and harness. Radios hummed softly, transmitting progress and checking on distant signals. Threads of connection across the cold expanse. Officers traced maps by lantern, plotting the subtle arcs of approach, aware of the balance between speed and caution. Snow muffled distant sounds, yet every echo was noted, a rhythm to which men adapted instinctively. The wind whispered over frozen roofs and open fields, soft and constant, carrying with it the pulse of motion from both sides. Men measured each hour, each mile, and each exchange with quiet attention, aware that every step mattered. Even in rest, the landscape pressed lessons in patience and persistence. And beneath this subdued night, the promise of reunion and relief remained tangible, moving closer with steady persistence. Snow-covered fields revealed subtle signs of movement, footprints, tracks, and marks that spoke to the progress of both pursuer and pursued. Scouts moved ahead, tracing paths and noting obstacles, their breaths rising in gentle clouds. Vehicles followed carefully, their engines humming a low rhythm across frozen ground. Infantry advanced between drifted fences, adjusting pace and posture to maintain cohesion. Fires burned low in villages, offering warmth without drawing attention, a soft counterpoint to the distant pulse of artillery. Horses shifted weight in their stalls, sharing heat with men and fellow animals alike. Maps were unfolded, tracing the approach in slow, deliberate arcs, ensuring that each step aligned with the larger strategy. Snow and frost altered perspective, making distances deceptive and requiring careful calculation. Even the simplest movement carried significance, a quiet acknowledgement of both danger and hope. And in the unfolding rhythm of approach, anticipation became as measured and constant as the fall of snow. The two forces drew closer, the rhythm of encircled soldiers blending with that of their approaching rescuers. Watches were synchronized, routines adjusted, and every minor task became a marker of progress. Messages crackled through the static, blending instructions with encouragement, and soldiers felt the faint pulse of connection. Tanks adjusted formation for frozen ground, engines steady against softening paths. Infantry moved with care, mindful of gaps and subtle obstacles, the snow amplifying every sound and vibration. Horses and men shared warmth and quiet, the rhythm of survival, merging with the rhythm of approach. Villages became brief shelters, spots to regroup and adjust, each pause reinforcing the forward momentum. Officers traced progress with meticulous attention, noting both distance and pressure from enemy positions. Even the wind seemed attuned to the slow advance, brushing across fields and trees without disturbing the fragile concentration of the forces. And beneath this layered rhythm, the sense of reunion grew, a subtle thread winding toward inevitability. By dawn, the horizon hinted at connection, the faint outlines of figures moving across snow toward each other. Soldiers in the pocket noted the subtle changes, listening to sounds of movement, faint and distant. Relief columns crested small rises, their engines humming in the quiet morning. Officers adjusted coordination, ensuring timing and spacing aligned with the fragile plan. Infantry and cavalry moved in careful synchrony, their presence both reassuring and tentative. Snow muffled some sounds and accentuated others, shaping perception of distance and progress. Horses stamped softly, their warmth a quiet anchor for human companions. Men whispered encouragement, maintaining composure while feeling the tension of approaching contact. Every step measured and deliberate, bringing the two forces closer in silent anticipation. And in the soft glow of dawn, the first promise of relief touched the edge of the pocket, subtle, steady, and undeniable. The frozen landscape bore witness to the tightening encirclement. As the Soviet lines pressed steadily against the advancing relief force, Villages once quiet havens had become outlines of their former selves, the air heavy with smoke, and the scent of burnt wood. Tanks and infantry moved cautiously through snow-packed streets, each step deliberate, each pause filled with anticipation. The rhythm of movement was punctuated by distant artillery, a soft yet persistent reminder of forces closing from all sides. Horses shifted in their harnesses, exhaling clouds of warm breath that mingled with the chill. Soldiers adjusted coats, gloves, and scarves, finding warmth in motion and in the company of companions. Officers measured distances with careful attention, aware that the margin for error had narrowed. Communications crackled faintly, the static carrying words of coordination and warnings of encroaching pressure. Even in this compressed landscape, subtle observation became a form of reassurance, each glance at snowdrifts or smoke signaling information. And beneath the quiet tension, a sense of inevitability pressed gently on every mind, steady and unyielding. The relief columns felt the subtle pushback almost immediately, snow and mud hindering movement, while Soviet forces applied constant pressure. Infantry adjusted their pace, moving with cautious synchronization to maintain cohesion despite obstacles. Tanks creaked and groaned, engines straining over frozen roads, softened by thawing snow. Officers whispered instructions to maintain formation, blending strategy with empathy, aware that exhaustion and frost weighed heavily. Horses shifted, muscles tensing and relaxing with the rhythm of cautious progress. Villages along the route were studied with meticulous care, recognizing each structure as potential shelter or obstacle. The distant hum of artillery wove through the white air, marking boundaries and signaling positions. Soldiers shared brief words of reassurance, measured and calm, sustaining the fragile thread of morale. Even the wind seemed to carry intention, brushing across rooftops and open fields as if to mirror the encroaching vice. And in this rhythm of advance and resistance, the space for hope contracted subtly, like snow settling into the curves of frozen earth. Inside the pocket, soldiers and civilians felt the pressure of the narrowing horseshoe with every passing hour. Movement beyond the edges of their positions became more urgent, yet each step carried caution and calculated risk. Men tended to horses, adjusting harnesses, feeding the animals with remnants of forage, a small ritual in the rhythm of survival. Officers maintained order and vigilance, balancing directives with the awareness of morale fraying beneath the cold and confinement. Snow pressed against walls and trenches, softening sounds and obscuring distance, making the outside world both nearer and more distant. Rations were stretched with meticulous care, each portion a small gesture of endurance. The rhythm of the day followed repetition, observation, preparation, rest, and quiet anticipation. Even in stillness, the encircled men felt the subtle pulse of the relief force moving closer and then halting, pushed back by unseen resistance. Every sound, every shifting shadow carried significance, measured in instinct and observation, and beneath these subtle cues, the tightening vice of encirclement grew steadily, shaping thought, action, and breath alike. Soviet counterattacks were relentless, moving in waves that shifted the contours of snow and earth. Tanks advanced through frozen fields, pausing to adjust their tracks, forming new patterns in the white landscape. Infantry followed cautiously, boots compressing snow, while maintaining rhythm with mechanized columns. Artillery pulses traveled like whispers, distant yet insistent, shaping the perception of threat and opportunity. Officers adjusted formations quietly, blending strategy with the tactile awareness of terrain and proximity. Horses exhaled softly, muscles coiling and relaxing as they adjusted to uneven ground. Villages became landmarks, their presence marking both progress and vulnerability. Even the frost seemed to shape movement, thickening under pressure, softening in thaw, always present yet silent. Soldiers measured each step against both danger and distance, blending patience with intent, and in the rhythm of advance and pushback, the narrowing horseshoe became a tangible presence, shaping every breath and decision. Losses began to mount, subtle yet cumulative, and the pocket's occupants felt the weight of attrition pressing on their minds. Horses weakened, food diminished, and supplies stretched ever thinner. Soldiers noted each absence, each strain in muscles and spirit, with quiet reflection rather than alarm. Officers reinforced routine, maintaining calm and discipline, even as pressure mounted. Snow drifted into trenches and over paths, softening tracks and concealing the subtle signs of movement. Fires burned low in dugouts and buildings, their warmth a small comfort against frost and anxiety. Communication crackled intermittently, carrying updates, adjustments, and cautious encouragement. Villages bore witness to the rhythm of attrition, buildings marked with frozen footprints and faint traces of hurried movement. Even in observation, the pattern of loss became a measured pulse, steady and unavoidable. And in the hush between each distant engagement, the narrowing vice seemed more present, pressing invisibly yet persistently. The winter wind carried both silence and echo, moving across fields, rooftops, and snow-laden trees. Soldiers listened, attuned to the subtle changes that marked both enemy activity and relief movement. Horses pawed at frozen ground, exhaling misty breath that mingled with the scent of frost and timber. Officers moved carefully along lines, speaking softly, reinforcing morale with quiet gestures and measured words. Snow-covered roads hid treacherous patches, requiring patience, calculation, and careful coordination. Artillery pulses traced soft arcs across the horizon, their distant presence shaping movement and thought. Infantry adjusted posture and pace, maintaining rhythm with mechanized columns and the surrounding terrain. Even small acts, a shared ration, a warm blanket, a whispered word, held significance, preserving cohesion against fatigue and encirclement. The rhythm of pressure and endurance intertwined, quiet yet insistent, and beneath these layers, the horseshoe of encirclement tightened, shaping perception and breath alike. Hopes of breakout became faint, measured against each pushback and obstacle. Soldiers in the pocket sensed the constriction in frozen muscles, in the subtle hesitation of movement, in the quiet monitoring of distant terrain. Officers calculated and recalculated, balancing urgency with caution, aware that any misstep might carry greater consequence than the snow alone. Horses shifted, ears twitching at the faintest sound, mirroring the tension of men nearby. Villages that might have offered rest or supplies had become zones of waiting and observation, their walls marked by frost and distant echoes. Artillery remained a steady pulse, marking time, shaping rhythm, and underscoring the narrowing space. Communications crackled, offering only partial reassurance, a mixture of instruction, hope, and delay. Snow pressed against doors and roofs, soft yet relentless, emphasizing the compression of both terrain and circumstance. Soldiers adjusted rations, blankets, and movement, maintaining a delicate balance between energy and exposure, and in the quiet moments between action, the tightening horseshoe was felt as an almost physical presence, gentle yet unyielding. By evening, the landscape seemed to hold its breath, the pressure of the encirclement pressing into every corner of trench, Building and field, soldiers huddled together, exhaling in rhythm with the frost around them. Horses rested in shifts, their warmth, a subtle anchor amid frozen expanses. Officers moved with measured care, reinforcing routine and morale in the quiet hours. Snow muffled distant sound, yet every faint echo was noted with deliberate attention. Small gestures passing water, sharing words, adjusting harnesses became rituals of endurance. Artillery and infantry pulses continued softly, a persistent rhythm threading through the frozen world. Villages were observed with careful scrutiny, their presence marking points of both passage and vulnerability. The encirclement pressed steadily, a subtle but persistent force shaping thought, movement, and breath. And in this quiet closing of space, the pocket settled into a tense rhythm, holding life, hope, and endurance together beneath the snow. The world within the encirclement moved at a slower, measured rhythm, shaped less by grand strategy than by the quiet necessities of survival. Soldiers crouched beside dim fires, their breath rising in pale clouds, and took pen to paper, writing letters they hoped might reach home. Each word was deliberate, carrying more weight than the hand could ever fully hold, a quiet reflection of memory, longing, and hope. Horses huddled near stables, shifting softly on frost-hardened earth, offering warmth in the smallest measure. Civilians, hidden in barns or beneath roofs, dusted with snow, whispered in hushed tones, sharing sustenance and reassurance. Medical units tended quietly to frostbite, exhaustion, and ailments that spread silently through cramped quarters. Even in scarcity, small rituals persisted, boiling water, distributing rations, and checking on the weakest first. The snow pressed softly against doors and windows, a gentle barrier that mirrored the pressure of circumstance. Soldiers and civilians alike measured each breath, each gesture, in rhythm with the day's slow passage. And beneath the hush, life endured, fragile yet persistent, beneath winter's soft insistence. Morning brought with it the hush of frost on rooftops and fields, the pale light reflecting in snow and ice. Men and women moved carefully, boots crunching softly over hardened paths, attending to tasks small and vital. Horses exhaled in rhythm with their caretakers, warmth shared as a quiet comfort against lingering chill. Letters were folded and stored, thoughts contained in paper that carried hope farther than bodies could travel. Medical teams worked steadily, attending with quiet diligence to those who suffered in silence, applying gentle care, even as supplies ran thin. Civilians shared warmth, blankets, and whispered stories of home, bridging distance and circumstance in small gestures. Fires burned low, smoke rising slowly into the cold air, carrying scent of wood and resilience. Soldiers checked weapons and equipment with deliberate care, though the quiet dominated more than the threat. The snow softened every sound, turning footsteps and movement into gentle whispers across the pocket. And in this slow rhythm of life, a fragile sense of continuity lingered, quiet but comforting. In tents and huts, men and women found small spaces of reflection, moments when fear could be set aside, if only briefly. Frost touched fingers and faces, a constant reminder of the environment shaping their bodies and thoughts. Horses shifted, the steady warmth beneath blankets, offering subtle reassurance to exhausted hands. Civilians crouched close to stoves, exchanging quiet words and soft laughter, the sound a gentle counterpoint to the outside tension. Soldiers traced letters, or small keepsakes with tender care, memories of home folding into the cold, rhythmic pulse of the day. Supplies were stretched, each ration accounted for, each measure precise, the act itself becoming a ritual of preservation. Snow drifted against walls, hiding the traces of movement, while marking time in subtle patterns. Officers moved quietly among their men, reinforcing order with gentle presence rather than command. Even the hum of distant artillery became background rhythm, softened by snow and distance. And beneath these quiet motions, the pocket pulsed with human endurance, fragile and unbroken. Children, rare and hidden, stirred softly under layers of blankets, their breath mingling with that of adults sharing warmth. Words were whispered in Ukrainian, fragments of song or memory, carrying comfort in delicate threads. Horses shifted restlessly, sensing human tension, yet offering steady presence. Letters continued to be written, folded and stored, each a bridge to distant homes. A quiet act of hope. Fires burned low, embers glowing beneath soot-stained chimneys, the warmth shared in gentle rhythms. Soldiers paused in their routines, folding hands together, adjusting layers or brushing snow from boots. Medical tents held hushed activity, movements and words, soft yet purposeful, tending to the unspoken needs of body and mind. Snow muffled the distant echoes of artillery and movement, wrapping the pocket in a fragile stillness. Even small gestures carried significance, handing bread, adjusting blankets, tending horses and quiet encouragement. And in the slow passage of hours, the day continued, measured in frost, breath, and the gentle persistence of life. Amid narrow streets and cramped shelters, conversation took on a quiet intimacy, voices low yet rich with presence. Soldiers shared memories, told stories of home, and offered small comforts with deliberate care. Civilians passed bowls of food or cups of warm tea, gestures measured yet meaningful. Horses nickered softly, shifting weight and warmth, part of the rhythm that sustained the pocket. Letters remained a private ritual, words carrying emotion that could not be spoken aloud, a tether to life beyond. Fires crackled gently, sending subtle scent and heat into frozen rooms. Boots were brushed, blankets arranged, rations divided with precision and empathy. Snow pressed against walls and rooftops, soft yet persistent, shaping perception of space and time. Officers moved quietly, reinforcing both routine and reassurance, a human cadence in frozen surroundings. And in every hushed sound and gentle movement, the pocket maintained its fragile, quiet heartbeat. Medical tents were a center of subdued motion, caretakers moving with precision and empathy among frostbitten and fatigued bodies. The cold intensified small struggles, but the rhythm of care persisted, each action deliberate and thoughtful. Soldiers assisted where they could, sharing warmth, blankets, and patience with those in need. Horses stood quietly nearby, their presence steady and reassuring against the gentle hum of human activity. Letters and personal items were held close, a reminder that the outside world continued, distant yet present. Fires crackled softly, smoke curling upward in thin, fragile ribbons, carrying scent and warmth through tents and shelters. Civilians moved cautiously, offering support in quiet gestures, a hand on a shoulder or the passing of water. Snow covered paths and streets, softening steps and muffling distant echoes of artillery. Officers maintained calm, ensuring that routine continued and that morale did not falter. And beneath the soft haze of frost and quiet effort, the pocket held together, fragile but enduring. The rhythm of the day continued, punctuated by simple, deliberate acts of endurance. Men adjusted coats, shared blankets, and moved quietly through tents and shelters. Civilians offered small comforts and whispered words of reassurance. bridging isolation with humanity. Horses nickered and shifted, warmth shared in subtle but essential measures. Letters were written, folded and treasured, each one carrying hope beyond the frostbound pocket. Fires burned steadily, their warmth soft yet insistent, holding back the chill of winter. Officers and soldiers measured each action, aware that every step and gesture reinforced the fragile stability. Snow pressed gently against walls, softening sound and enveloping the world in muted white. Even distant artillery seemed softened, reduced to a background rhythm rather than urgent threat. And in the slow, steady cadence of routine and care, life within the pocket continued, tender, deliberate and quietly persistent. As evening settled, frost glimmered across rooftops, and the pocket exhaled a measured calm. Soldiers huddled together, sharing warmth and whispered words, their breath rising in soft clouds. Horses rested near their caretakers, exhaling rhythmically, offering quiet assurance in stillness. Civilians gathered close, passing tea, bread and small comforts, their gestures slow and meaningful. Letters were tucked away, hopes folded into paper and stored with care. Fires glowed softly, the scent of smoke and wood rising into the cold night air. Medical tents maintained their hushed vigilance, movements quiet yet precise, tending to those who required gentle attention. Snow-blanketed streets and fields, softening footsteps and muting distant echoes. Officers circulated slowly, reinforcing routine and calm, their presence steadying against the subtle tension of isolation. And in this intimate pause, the human world inside the pocket persisted, delicate yet resilient, beneath the gentle weight of frost and silence. General Stemmermann moved quietly through the snow-dusted streets of the pocket, each step measured, each glance heavy with the weight of responsibility. His mind traced maps, numbers and possibilities, yet each option seemed constricted, bound by frost and circumstance. Thousands of lives rested in his hands, soldiers and civilians alike, all dependent on decisions that carried no clear right answer. Hitler's orders forbade retreat, insisting that the bulge be held, a fortress unmoving against the wintered land. Yet every day the encirclement pressed tighter, and each message from Berlin felt more like chains than guidance. Officers and soldiers looked to him for reassurance, their eyes reflecting trust, fear, and quiet exhaustion. He walked past horses huddled in stables, their warm breath rising in mist, a soft reminder of continuity amid uncertainty. Snow pressed gently against rooftops and fences, muffling distant movement, and lending a quiet rhythm to his reflections. Letters from soldiers' hands were folded carefully, small gestures of hope reaching beyond the pocket. And in the stillness, the burden of impossible choices weighed steadily, shaping each step and thought. The dilemma became a constant presence, settling into every calculation and observation. Stemmermann considered a breakout tracing arcs through frozen fields and forests, measuring distance, snow, and enemy disposition. Yet the weight of orders from above, the fidelity demanded by the chain of command, held him frozen in place. Soldiers moved with disciplined routine, unaware of the full tension pressing behind their officers' eyes. Horses shifted restlessly in frost-bitten stables, sensitive to the quiet strain in human companions. Villages offered points of observation, places to pause and consider the movement of forces. Yet each building was marked by both hope and hazard. Supplies dwindled slowly, each ration a subtle gauge of endurance. The rhythm of snow, wind and quiet observation became a backdrop to endless mental calculations. Even the distant pulse of artillery seemed to press upon thought, a gentle reminder that time, like snow, was accumulating steadily. And beneath all this, Stemmermann's awareness of the lives depending on him formed a subtle, persistent weight. At night, he walked among the encircled troops, observing the quiet rhythms of survival. Soldiers tended horses, adjusted blankets, and measured each step across frozen paths with deliberate care. Civilians exchanged soft words, huddled for warmth, carrying memories and hope through the frost. Letters were folded, tucked, and treasured, a private connection to distant homes. And Stemmermann understood the fragility held in each paper thread. Fires burned low, sending warmth and faint scent into tents and homes, softening the chill of frost and anxiety. Medical units moved quietly, tending to frostbite and exhaustion, with patient hands and subdued presence. The snow outside pressed softly against walls and windows, muffling distant sounds while emphasizing the rhythm within. Officers spoke gently, offering reassurance, maintaining discipline while concealing the uncertainty of command. Horses shifted beneath blankets of straw, their warmth shared in subtle, unconscious gestures. And in these slow, intimate moments, the weight of impossible choice lingered quietly, with the general pressing yet unseen. Each morning brought the same cold clarity. The encirclement had not loosened, and the relief effort pressed against resistance. Stemmermann traced every possible route of breakout, considering enemy positions, snowdrifts, and frozen streams. Orders from Berlin echoed relentlessly, forbidding retreat, defining the limits of choice, yet offering no solution. Soldiers followed routine with quiet determination, their movements rhythmic, disciplined, and unaware of the calculus weighing on their commander. Horses exhaled softly, muscles shifting in response to subtle movements of men and snow. Villages along the edge of the pocket were studied carefully, each building offering both opportunity and risk. Rations were measured, blankets adjusted, supplies accounted for with patient thoroughness. The wind whispered across rooftops and open fields, carrying frost and sound with gentle persistence. Every step, observation, and calculation reminded Stemmermann that time was both ally and adversary. And beneath these rhythms, the dilemma pressed steadily, shaping thought, action, and breath alike. His reflections traced the delicate boundary between duty and necessity, loyalty and pragmatism. Could he act against orders and risk the wrath of Berlin to preserve life? Each possibility was measured carefully, weighed against potential loss, against the snow, the frost, the tightening pocket. Soldiers and civilians depended on him to navigate an impossible path through winter and encirclement. Horses shifted gently, their warm presence a quiet anchor amid cold and tension. Villages blanketed in snow were small markers of both hope and hazard, points to pause and consider. Artillery pulses and distant echoes threaded through frozen fields, a subtle pressure shaping movement and expectation. Officers walked among their men, offering soft words and measured gestures, balancing reassurance against the unspoken reality of their predicament. Even as night pressed gently over the pocket, the question of action or compliance lingered, constant and inescapable. And in the quiet folds of winter, Stemmermann's burden settled upon him, invisible yet tangible, shaping every thought and decision. The snow outside seemed to mirror the complexity of choice, soft, persistent, and inescapable. Soldiers went about routine with quiet rhythm, adjusting blankets, feeding horses, checking weapons, each motion purposeful, yet small. Letters and personal items were held close, fragile threads connecting those within the pocket to a world beyond frost and encirclement. Fires burned low, warmth rising in muted clouds, offering comfort and perspective amid uncertainty. Medical teams moved steadily, tending quietly to the weary and the frostbitten. Officers reinforced morale through presence and calm, subtle gestures, bridging the gap between tension and reassurance. Every decision, no matter how minor, carried weight, forming the intricate lattice of responsibility that bound Stemmermann to his command. Even the distant hum of artillery became part of the rhythm of thought, a soft reminder of pressures pressing inward, snow pressed against walls and rooftops, muffling sound yet amplifying the sense of confinement. And in the hush of frost and reflection, the general's dilemma endured, patient and persistent. The hours stretched with quiet inevitability, each movement deliberate, each observation attentive. Stemmermann traced maps, mentally moving men and horses across frozen terrain, considering angles, arcs, and distances. Orders from Berlin remained unchanged, fixed in expectation, yet blind to circumstance, pressing upon him like invisible frost. Soldiers followed routines with steady determination, unaware of the mental weight shaping every calculated pause. Horses shifted gently, warmth shared as silent comfort against winter and tension. Villages marked points of decision, their snow-laden streets and frozen rooftops, offering perspective on the scope of action and consequence. Rations and supplies were accounted for meticulously, small gestures of care anchoring the day in rhythm and precision. The wind carried snow softly across the pocket, muffling distant sounds and shaping the quiet world around him. Officers circulated slowly, maintaining order and calm, blending discipline with empathy. And beneath the rhythm of winter, the burden of impossible choices persisted, shaping every heartbeat, thought, and step. As night fell, Stemmermann paused atop a slight rise, snow crunching softly beneath his boots, and looked across the encircled expanse. The pocket below seemed still yet alive, a fragile mosaic of tents, horses, and human presence, all bound by frost and circumstance. Each lantern glowed faintly in frozen streets, a gentle measure of continuity and hope. Letters were tucked away carefully, words held like small precious weights of connection. Fires burned low, sending warmth into tents, stables, and makeshift shelters, the glow reflecting on frost-laden rooftops. Soldiers huddled near companions, adjusting blankets and clothing, exchanging quiet encouragement and measured words. Medical teams moved softly, a rhythm of care threaded into the fabric of survival. Snow pressed gently over rooftops, muffling movement while marking the passage of hours. Officers moved with calm deliberation, balancing orders, morale, and circumstance in equal measure. And beneath the quiet of night, Stemmermann's dilemma lingered, patient and persistent, shaping thought, breath, and action as frost settled gently over the pocket. In the dim light of lanterns, maps were spread across tables, the edges dusted with frost and soot. As officers traced lines and paths with steady hands, General Stemmermann and his aides leaned over the fragile diagrams, voices low, deliberate, carrying weight and caution. The breakout had to occur under the cover of darkness, through snow-laden fields and icy rivers, with every step measured against uncertainty. Horses shifted softly in nearby stables, their warm breath rising in mist, a gentle counterpoint to the tension indoors. Soldiers gathered quietly, listening to instructions, tracing imagined paths across frozen terrain, internalizing each detail with solemn care. The wind outside whispered through rooftops and chimneys, carrying both frost and the muted rhythm of a pocket holding its breath. Supplies were checked meticulously, rations and ammunition measured for endurance rather than abundance. Every moment was a balance of patience and urgency, a delicate harmony between hope and hazard. Even the flicker of candlelight seemed to pulse in rhythm with thought, illuminating maps and faces alike. And in this quiet, deliberate preparation, the first threads of a daring attempt began to weave through the pocket, fragile but undeniable. Each officer carried a weight of calculation and responsibility, balancing both the lives of soldiers and the unforgiving winter landscape. Snow outside pressed softly against walls and windows, muffling distant sounds and concentrating focus on the maps within. Horses shifted and nickered gently, instinctive reminders of motion, warmth, and endurance. Men studied the outlines of forests, rivers, and villages, noting obstacles and opportunities with quiet precision. Words were measured, questions asked and answered with care, each exchange a soft ripple in a tense rhythm. Lantern light illuminated frost-bitten faces, eyes reflecting both fatigue and resolve. Every route considered carried a mixture of promise and peril, a careful negotiation between survival and the inevitability of risk. Even the distant hum of artillery became part of this rhythm, shaping judgment without dominating thought. Officers traced lines repeatedly, imagining the path beneath snow, ice, and moonlight. And in the hush of planning, a quiet determination settled over the room, steady and deliberate. The plan required careful timing, the coordination of infantry, mechanized units, and horse-drawn wagons, all moving as one measured organism. Soldiers practiced the rhythms of movement quietly, boots pressing softly against frost-hardened floors, hands adjusting straps and harnesses. Horses were led gently, exhaling warm mist into cold air, trained to respond to subtle cues and rhythms of command. Maps were referenced repeatedly, distances estimated by eye and by compass, each officer aware that every step mattered. Supplies were packed with deliberate care, distributed to those who would carry them through night and frost. The wind outside carried snow in gentle drifts, softening tracks, muffling sound, and masking intentions from unseen observers. Soldiers whispered last instructions and reassurances, the soft cadence of words threading through the quiet room. Officers adjusted formations in mind and on paper, balancing speed against caution and risk against necessity. Even small gestures, tightening a strap, checking a harness, exchanging a glance, carried quiet significance. And beneath the lantern light, the breakout plan coalesced into a fragile, determined rhythm that moved silently toward action. Horses stamped softly in stables, their warmth shared with men adjusting equipment and checking supplies. Each harness, each strap, each trace of tack was inspected with care, the quiet motion part of a broader, deliberate rhythm. Soldiers moved through snow-packed streets, boots compressing powdery frost, rehearsing coordination in hushed steps. Officers spoke softly, tracing imaginary lines across terrain, considering moonlight, drifted snow and frozen rivers. Fires burned low, their glow casting gentle warmth, and reflecting in the frost on walls and windows. Every ration was measured and packed, each piece of equipment assigned purpose and place. Snow pressed gently against rooftops, muting distant echoes and concentrating attention inward. Artillery pulses from afar carried quietly, a distant heartbeat threading through the hushed planning. Horses exhaled mist into still air, a soft rhythmic companion to human calculation. And in this delicate alignment of men, animals, and winter, the rhythm of preparation carried steady, patient momentum toward action. Officers held quiet council as night deepened, the lanterns flickering softly against drafts and frost-laden panes. The breakout could only succeed in the careful interplay of observation, timing, and measured courage. Soldiers listened, absorbing instructions, tracing paths, imagining the rhythm of snow beneath boots, the pull of sleds, the careful movement of wagons. Horses shifted, muscles coiling and relaxing with instinctive precision, a gentle rhythm mirrored in the movements of men. Villages along the projected path were considered both shelter and hazard, moments of safety folded into arcs of risk. Maps were traced again and again, each line, river, and elevation carefully reconciled with imagination and experience. Supplies were organized into small portable units, each item deliberate and essential. The snow muffled distant sound, carrying only the faintest pulse of enemy activity, yet shaping judgment in subtle ways. Even a whisper, a soft shuffle, a shifting horse, became part of the measured rhythm of preparation, and in the quiet, candle-lit space, the breakout plan settled into readiness, fragile, patient, and intentional. The first hours of night demanded discipline. Each soldier and horse attuned to rhythm and expectation. Lanterns were lowered, fires kept minimal, and silence became a companion to movement. Horses nickered softly, muscles tense but responsive, exhaling warmth into the frost-laden air. Men adjusted packs, harnesses, and clothing, rehearsing movements that would soon thread through snow and moonlight. Officers traced routes mentally, imagining the curve of rivers, the drift of snow, the line of forests, and the edges of frozen fields. Artillery pulses carried faintly, distant yet persistent, shaping perception of space, distance, and urgency. Villages became markers of observation, points to pass or avoid, their frozen streets silent and waiting. Every gesture, every whispered instruction, every shared glance contributed to a rhythm of preparation that pulsed quietly through the pocket. Snow pressed gently against windows and rooftops, muffling sound and emphasizing the hush of readiness. And beneath this calm, deliberate tension, the breakout plan existed as both fragile hope and measured risk, ready to move through wintered silence. The soldier's anticipation threaded through each careful motion, a quiet cadence shaping breath, thought, and step. Horses shifted, nuzzling companions or stamping softly on frost-hardened ground, warmth shared in subtle rhythm. Officers circulated with deliberate care, reinforcing instructions, adjusting supplies, and confirming alignment of movement. Letters and personal effects were stowed, small threads connecting past and present, human warmth folded into packs and blankets. Snow drifted softly against walls and rooftops, muffling sound and shaping perception of space and distance. Lanterns flickered faintly, casting soft shadows that marked faces and maps in warm, gentle light. Every action was measured, every breath deliberate, each step a rehearsal of intent and timing. The distant rhythm of artillery persisted, a quiet heartbeat, threading through winter's hush. Soldiers adjusted straps, harnesses, and blankets, finding comfort in routine and preparation. And as night deepened, the breakout plan pulsed with potential, a careful, fragile rhythm moving toward inevitable action. In the final hours before movement, silence became a companion to anticipation, steady and measured. Stemmermann traced routes with his mind, imagining columns, horses, and infantry threading through snow, rivers, and forests. Soldiers prepared quietly, checking equipment, adjusting packs, and rehearsing the cadence of movement that would soon guide them west. Horses shifted beneath blankets, exhaling warmth, their subtle rhythm mirrored in human companions. Lantern light glimmered softly across maps and faces, illuminating focus, reflection, and intent. Fires burned low, warmth curling upward in muted tendrils, a gentle counterpoint to the cold pressing outside. Villages marked points of observation and passage, frozen streets holding both promise and danger. Artillery pulses carried faintly across the snow, soft but insistent, shaping both caution and expectation. Each gesture, glance, and whispered instruction contributed to the rhythm of the breakout, measured and deliberate. And in this quiet, frost-laden world, the plan held together, fragile, patient, and poised to move into the night. The night held its breath as the encircled columns moved quietly across frost-hardened fields, boots pressing softly against snow that had crystallized under the moonlight. Horses shifted in measured rhythm, exhaling warm mist into the cold air, each step careful, deliberate, a dance with both survival and uncertainty. Soldiers adjusted packs and straps, their movements quiet but precise, attuned to the rhythm of the moment and the fragile line of order holding the breakout together. Lanterns and small fires were extinguished, leaving only the faint glow of moonlight to guide figures threading through frozen terrain. Snow-muffled steps and hushed words, making the world both intimate and expansive, a corridor of silence stretching across the steppe. The air held a crystalline sharpness, cold enough to bite fingertips and noses, yet it also carried the soft scent of frost and earth beneath the snow. Rivers glinted under pale light, their frozen surfaces offering both passage and hidden peril. The first columns moved with care, tracing paths imagined and rehearsed, holding the fragile hope of escape. Every step was measured, every breath deliberate, a rhythm of tension and persistence, and beneath the hush of night, the breakout had begun, quiet yet inexorably moving forward. At first, the steppe seemed vast and still, a frozen expanse holding only the whisper of movement. Columns pressed onward, careful to maintain formation, each horse and soldier moving in shared rhythm. Lanterns were darkened, equipment adjusted, breaths measured, all in delicate balance with the night and frost. Snow drifted softly over boots and hooves, erasing tracks as if to protect the fragile advance. Soldiers whispered instructions, their words gentle yet precise, threading coordination into every step. Rivers loomed ahead, silent but dangerous, their frozen surfaces cracking under careful weight. Horses shifted uneasily, sensing the tension that rippled through human companions, muscles coiled and ready. The wind carried subtle echoes across the plains, muted yet persistent, a reminder of both isolation and pressure. Each movement held a fragile hope, a rhythm shared among thousands of bodies and animals. And as the night deepened, the columns pressed onward, determined yet tender in their careful advance. Suddenly, distant echoes trembled through the frost-laden air, subtle at first, then insistent, the pulse of artillery and flares illuminating stretches of the frozen steppe. The quiet shattered, replaced by a measured chaos that rippled through snow and air. Soldiers and horses adjusted instinctively, movements shaped by both training and survival, a delicate dance with uncertainty. Rivers became both pathway and obstacle, ice cracking beneath weight, sending cold shocks through boots and hooves alike. Horses stumbled, their warmth shared with those steadying them, a subtle rhythm of mutual reliance. Columns wove through terrain, each soldier sensing the pulse of danger in frost and shadow. Lanterns remained dark, eyes attuned to moonlight, the soft glint of ice, the rhythm of movement around them. Snow absorbed sound in strange ways, muffling some echoes while amplifying others, shaping perception and decision. Orders moved quietly down lines, whispered yet deliberate, threading coordination through subtle chaos. And beneath this tension, the push across frozen terrain persisted, fragile, determined, and human. Men adjusted their pace to the rhythm of snow, ice, and cold rivers, each step measured against fatigue and frostbite. Horses stumbled but recovered, warm breath misting in the frigid air, muscles responding to gentle guidance. Soldiers felt the tension coiling in both body and mind, the pulse of movement shaped by danger and necessity. Rivers reflected moonlight, deceptive in their silent glow, sometimes frozen, sometimes treacherous beneath thin layers of ice. Snowflakes drifted slowly, soft against faces, carrying with them the scent of cold earth and endurance. The distant rhythm of artillery and searchlights created a subtle, persistent pressure, shaping both pace and thought. Columns threaded through villages and open fields alike, careful to maintain cohesion despite the chaos pressing inward. Lanterns remained dim, fires extinguished, leaving the night to guide and obscure simultaneously. Soldiers and horses alike moved in quiet synchrony, instinct and rehearsal guiding each step. And beneath the frost and shadow, the breakout pressed onward, fragile yet deliberate in rhythm and resolve. Flares erupted in the distance, painting frozen fields in fleeting spectral light, casting shadows that danced across snow and ice. Soldiers pressed forward, instinctively adjusting to the rhythm of both illumination and hazard. Horses stamped lightly, shifting weight, ears flicking, muscles responding with instinctive precision. Columns moved in waves, careful to maintain formation despite the tremor of tension threading through the night. Rivers became obstacles, ice cracking beneath careful steps, water seeping coldly through boots. Yet the momentum did not falter. Orders moved quietly along lines, carried in whispers and gestures, threading coordination through individual rhythm. Snow drifted across the terrain, softening sound and sight, hiding both peril and possibility. Lanterns remained dimmed, fires suppressed, the cold guiding movement as much as moonlight. Each breath was measured, each step deliberate, a rhythm shared among thousands of living, breathing forms. And in the hush between flares, the breakout continued, fragile, precise, and tenacious. Horses faltered under icy strain, some collapsing briefly, only to rise with careful guidance from men pressing forward. Soldiers lent hands, steadying mounts, sharing warmth and tracing paths across frozen terrain. Snow reflected pale moonlight, glimmering in patterns that both guided and distracted. Rivers challenged the column, their surfaces breaking under careful weight, sending shivers through boots and hooves alike. The wind carried cold and faint scents of earth and frost, threading through both human and animal companions. Columns maintained rhythm, adjusting pace to obstacles, flares, and subtle pulses of danger. Lanterns remained dark, fires extinguished, the night itself a guide and partner in movement. Every gesture, glance, and whispered word threaded through the fragile organization of escape. Horses exhaled warm mist, a quiet reassurance to those moving with them, steadying nerves and rhythm alike. And through rivers, snow, and frozen fields, the breakout pressed on, fragile yet insistent, human and animal entwined in wintered perseverance. Flares continued to illuminate brief stretches of snow, fleeting and ghost-like, shaping movement through both caution and instinct. Soldiers pressed through drifts and icy tracks, boots and hooves, finding rhythm in careful coordination. Rivers challenged progress, ice groaning and cracking beneath deliberate steps. Yet momentum persisted, horses shifted and stamped softly, muscles taut, breath misting in the cold, responding to subtle guidance. Snow drifted lightly, masking tracks, muffling sound, and shaping perception across frozen fields. Orders moved quietly, whispered across lines, threading cohesion and understanding through thousands of individuals. Lanterns remained dark, fires suppressed, moonlight and instinct guiding step and pace. Each movement was a measured negotiation between survival and determination. Rhythm and instinct intertwined, columns adjusted, paused, and pressed forward. guided by both careful planning and the quiet pulse of urgency. And beneath the ghostly flare-lit fields, the breakout endured, fragile yet unyielding. By the first pale light of February morning, the frozen steppe carried the traces of human effort, a mosaic of movement across snow and ice. Soldiers and horses pressed forward, bodies tired, muscles stiffened, yet driven by determination and necessity. Rivers remained cautious obstacles, ice yielding in parts, holding in others, guiding rhythm and pace. Columns moved in careful waves, adjusting to terrain, flares and distant pulses of enemy fire. Horses shifted and breathed warm mist into cold air, muscles responding in quiet synchronization with human companions. Snow muffled sound, softened motion, yet also marked passage, every step a testament to endurance. Lanterns remained dim, fires low, the quiet persistence of wintered night, guiding movement into dawn. Orders and gestures threaded along lines, subtle, deliberate, reinforcing coordination in delicate rhythm. Each breath and step carried significance, shaping both survival and shared momentum. And as pale light spread across frozen fields, the breakout continued, fragile, human, and quietly relentless, carrying thousands toward uncertain morning. The Gniloy Tikich stretched before the columns like a silver ribbon of ice and shadow, its surface trembling beneath pale winter light. Soldiers approached cautiously, boots crunching on frost-bitten banks, breath visible in the cold air, muscles tense with both effort and apprehension. Horses shuffled nervously, nostrils flaring, warm breath rising in mist that mingled with the frozen river's whisper. Water lapped against legs and hooves as men waded in, icy currents pressing insistently, cold wrapping each step like a quiet, unyielding hand. Bridges groaned under weight, planks slipping with frost and wear, each careful passage threaded with risk. Columns moved in deliberate rhythm, guided by whispered instructions, hands steadying one another, sharing warmth and focus. Snow drifted gently over frozen banks, muffling distant echoes, while highlighting the pulse of motion within the river. Lanterns were dark, fires suppressed, the night and moonlight shaping perception of path and pace. Orders moved quietly along lines, subtle gestures threading coordination through thousands of bodies and animals. And beneath the icy current, the first steps across the river wove a fragile rhythm of perseverance through chaos. Horses faltered under the pressure of icy water, hooves slipping against frozen stones, yet they rose again with careful guidance. Soldiers pressed forward, breath clouding the air, hands gripping straps, weapons or companions to maintain alignment. The river's surface shivered under movement, cracks appearing in the ice, revealing dark, swift water beneath. Each step carried tension, the faint rhythm of currents and shifting snow marking passage and hazard alike. The wind whispered softly across the riverbanks, carrying cold and a faint, metallic scent from the frozen landscape. Columns adjusted in silent waves, responding to obstacles, fallen equipment and hesitating animals with quiet resolve. Lanterns remained dimmed, eyes attuned to moonlight and the reflected silver of ice, shaping careful coordination. Soldiers and horses shared subtle rhythms, a gentle communication of movement, breath and balance. Snow drifted lightly, masking tracks, while highlighting edges and rocks, guiding rhythm without words. And in this delicate frozen passage, each step threaded the fragile pulse of life, forward through icy uncertainty. Sudden eruptions of distant artillery and flares cast fleeting light across the river, illuminating frozen currents and tentative figures. Soldiers instinctively tightened formation, hands and eyes guiding companions, muscles responding to rhythm and instinct. Horses exhaled warm mist, muscles coiled, adjusting to subtle cues in both snow and water. The river challenged every step, currents tugging with quiet insistence, ice threatening to crack beneath boots and hooves alike. Columns moved in deliberate waves, timing steps with shifting currents, bridges, and occasional submerged hazards. Lanterns were extinguished, fires suppressed, relying entirely on sight, touch, and intuition to navigate the frozen maze. Snow fell gently, drifting against shoulders and backs, muffling sound while marking rhythm of movement. Orders traveled silently along lines, gestures and whispers threading subtle coordination. Every step and breath was measured, a rhythm of human and animal determination shaping fragile momentum. And beneath the flare-lit night, the river became both obstacle and teacher, demanding care, patience, and endurance. Men paused briefly on solid banks, snow pressed against boots, and the edges of frost-laden ground, catching breath and sharing warmth. Horses stamped lightly, muscles relaxed for a moment before stepping back into icy current. Soldiers adjusted straps, blankets, and packs, checking each connection, each harness, each subtle balance of weight and motion. The river pressed steadily, relentless, yet the rhythm of crossing moved forward, shaped by breath, coordination, and instinct. Lanterns remained dark, the faint glow of ice reflecting pale moonlight, guiding path without intrusion. Flares illuminated sections of frozen water in spectral flashes, shadows dancing briefly before returning to the muted silvered hush. Columns wove carefully, adjusting to currents, fallen logs, and shifting ice, a fragile choreography threaded through thousands of bodies. Snow drifted gently across shoulders, mingling with icy water, a quiet companion to the deliberate pulse of movement. Horses exhaled warm mist, a subtle reassurance threading connection between human and animal alike. And in the brief pauses along the banks, the rhythm of perseverance persisted, patient, deliberate, and fragile. Stemmermann's staff car appeared briefly on the far bank, tires crunching over frost, carrying both command and uncertainty. A sudden volley of distant fire rocked the frozen expanse, metal and frost meeting in whispered echoes across water and snow. The car jolted, its motion halted by hidden hazards, and the general fell softly, snow cushioning a momentary descent. Soldiers reacted instinctively, guiding horses, adjusting formation, and continuing the fragile rhythm of the crossing without hesitation. The river pressed onward, cold and unyielding, its current demanding coordination and balance at every step. Snow drifted softly over frozen banks, muffling distant sound, while emphasizing the immediate pulse of movement. Lanterns remained dark, eyes attuned to reflective ice and faint moonlight, mapping rhythm without words. Horses exhaled warmth into freezing currents, muscles responding instinctively to human guidance. Every gesture, glance, and whisper threaded through columns, shaping endurance and survival across treacherous water. And beneath the river's silvered surface, the fragile determination of thousands pressed forward, patient and unbroken despite chaos. Corpses of animals and men, frozen in place along ice or banks, marked the quiet cost of passage, yet the living moved around them with calm persistence. Soldiers lent hands, guided companions, and adjusted footing, embedding subtle rhythms into every step. The river's current tugged insistently, cold biting through boots, gloves, and clothing, demanding focus, balance, and coordination. Horses slipped occasionally, regaining footing with careful guidance, sharing warmth with human companions. Columns moved in waves, pauses measured, steps deliberate, rhythms intertwined between breath, snow, and water. Lanterns remained dimmed, fires suppressed, moonlight and instinct, guiding movement through frost and hazard. Snow drifted lightly over shoulders, masking footprints, while marking boundaries and rhythm. Orders traveled along lines quietly, gestures carrying communication through tense, frozen air. Soldiers and animals alike found their pace in the subtle cadence of survival. Step by step, breath by breath, and through the chaos and chill, the pulse of endurance threaded across ice and river, fragile but unbroken. The river narrowed, currents quickened, ice groaning under the pressure of boots and hooves, yet movement persisted. Soldiers adjusted their pace, hands steadying companions, breath measured against wind and water. Horses shifted instinctively, muscles coiled, mist rising in visible clouds, rhythmically exhaling warmth into frozen currents. Columns moved with careful coordination, bridges crossed, rivers forded, every step calculated against cold, hazard, and necessity. Lanterns remained dark, fires minimal, relying on reflection and instinct to shape forward motion. Snow drifted gently, softening sound while guiding perception across ice, frozen banks, and shadowed pools. Orders moved quietly along lines, whispered gestures threading coordination and calm determination. Every breath, glance, and step reinforced the rhythm of survival, shaping momentum through cold and uncertainty. Horses and men moved together, a shared rhythm of endurance, adaptation, and fragile hope. And in the cold, silvered light of winter, the river became both crucible and passage, carrying the Breakout onward with measured persistence. By dawn, columns emerged from the Gniloy Tikich, water dripping from boots, blankets, and harnesses, muscles stiff but rhythm maintained. Horses shook snow and ice from coats, exhaling warm mist into crisp morning air, bodies sharing resilience with companions. Soldiers moved slowly at first, recovering balance and breath, tracing careful steps onto snow-dusted banks. Lanterns remained dim, fires low, the pale light of February morning guiding rhythm and movement forward. The river behind bore frozen traces of passage, both loss and survival embedded in ice and snow. Columns adjusted formation, continuing west, careful to preserve fragile cohesion in the aftermath of chaotic crossing. Snow drifted softly across shoulders and equipment, marking rhythm and path with quiet persistence. Horses exhaled warmth, muscles adjusting to firm ground, sharing a subtle cadence with humans who guided them. Orders traveled in whispers and gestures, threading coordination along the fragile, exhausted column. And through frost, river, and silence, the Breakout pressed on, patient, fragile, and quietly unbroken, carrying thousands toward uncertain morning. The pale light of morning spread softly across the frost-laden fields, revealing columns of survivors moving in staggered rhythm, some limping, others supported by comrades. Snow pressed gently against boots, equipment, and uniforms, muffling distant sounds, while marking each step in silent testimony. Horses walked quietly beside soldiers, muscles stiff, but breathing warm mist into the cold air, carrying both load and rhythm. Men glanced toward forests and villages ahead, gauging distance and terrain, every movement measured against exhaustion and uncertainty. Small groups broke from larger formations, seeking paths less observed, fragments of divisions pressed into survival. The distant hum of artillery had faded into intermittent echoes, leaving only wind and snow as companions to careful motion. Lanterns were low or absent, eyes guided by pale light, reflecting off frost and river ice. Every breath was visible in the cold air, a delicate rhythm of human endurance threading forward, steps pressed carefully over uneven ground, tracing paths both familiar and hazardous. And through frost and quiet the remnants of the pocket pressed onward, fragile yet determined. Some columns were nearly unrecognizable, ragged threads of former divisions, boots worn through, clothing frozen stiff. Soldiers leaned on one another, sharing warmth and momentum, a rhythm of human connection amid desolation. Horses exhaled softly, muscles responding to subtle guidance, supporting movement through frost and fatigue. Groups merged and split, adjusting paths to avoid obstacles and to preserve cohesion where possible. Snow drifted lightly across shoulders, softening the traces of passage, while moonlight still lingered faintly on frozen fields. Weapons and equipment were pared down, carried with careful purpose, stripped of anything extraneous. Even minor gestures, a hand on a shoulder, a shared blanket, a whispered encouragement, carried weight, shaping morale and rhythm. Lanterns remained dim, fires extinguished, relying on instinct and observation to guide motion. Columns wove cautiously through villages and fields, shadows threading movement across frozen terrain. And with every careful step, survivors etched forward, fragile yet persistent, toward the tentative promise of relief. Across the open fields, some units disappeared entirely, absorbed into the snow, or lost to the quiet sweep of enemy observation. Small groups hesitated at crossroads, balancing the risk of exposure against the pull of survival, each decision deliberate and fraught. Horses nickered softly, sensing hesitation, muscles tensing and releasing with subtle cues from riders. Soldiers adjusted packs, shared blankets, offered guidance to those faltering, embedding quiet rhythm into fragmented lines. Snow drifted over tracks, masking paths while highlighting edges, guiding movement without words. Lanterns remained dark, the soft pulse of daylight providing both clarity and caution. Conversations were sparse, words murmured with care, threading coordination and reassurance through the exhausted columns. The distant murmur of artillery faded entirely, replaced by wind whispering across frozen fields and broken villages. Every gesture, step, and glance carried significance, each action a subtle thread holding fragments together, and beneath this pale morning light, the scattered survivors pressed forward, measured, quiet, and fragile in determination. Finally, distant signals of relief appeared along the horizon, small figures moving toward broken columns, carrying hope in measured rhythm. Soldiers lifted weary heads adjusting packs and harnesses, moving toward the approaching presence with careful steps. Horses responded instinctively, muscles coiling and releasing, mist curling into the cold air, sharing warmth and momentum. Columns gathered slowly, weaving fragments of units into temporary cohesion, each step a testament to endurance. Snow drifted lightly over frozen ground, muffling sound, shaping both perception and pace. Officers and soldiers shared whispered coordination, establishing paths and orders for the fragile merge. Weapons were checked lightly, packs adjusted, blankets shared in subtle gestures of care. Lanterns remained dim, fires absent, daylight and instinct, guiding forward movement. Every breath, every glance, every careful step carried significance, threading rhythm into fractured groups. And through frost, quiet and tentative hope, survivors began to coalesce, fragile yet moving toward safety. Some divisions arrived nearly intact, though many were mere shadows of former strength, boots worn, faces pale, eyes distant. Columns adjusted slowly, horses breathing mist into the pale air, carrying riders and load through careful rhythm. Men lent hands, offered blankets, shared warmth, stabilizing both themselves and companions. Snow drifted across shoulders, marking paths and pace, while the distant relief formed a quiet anchor for coordination. Lanterns remained dark, eyes tuned to frost and frozen ground, instinct shaping careful steps. Conversations were muted, whispers carrying encouragement, reassurance, and subtle guidance across staggered lines. Small groups that had lost contact merged tentatively, exchanging information and coordinating movement with delicate care. Every gesture, glance, and breath contributed to the rhythm of survival. Fragile but persistent, columns pressed onward slowly, merging into larger formations, while preserving the individual momentum of those who had survived. And in this careful, measured motion, fragments of the pocket pressed toward tentative safety, carrying memory, endurance, and quiet resilience. Yet tens of thousands remained behind, lost to snow, river, or the sweep of battle, their absence etched into the rhythm of movement. Silent pauses marked crossings and junctions, eyes scanning horizons, hands steadying companions, hearts weighed by memory. Horses adjusted to shifting burdens, muscles coiled and released in synchrony with human effort. Columns navigated frozen fields and broken villages with deliberate caution. Steps careful, breath measured, rhythm shared. Lanterns remained low, fires suppressed, movement guided by instinct and observation. Snow drifted lightly across boots and shoulders, softening sound and shaping perception of distance and pace. Whispers threaded along lines, gestures coordinating movement across fragmented formations. Every shared glance, every extended hand, every careful footstep carried significance in the fragile ballet of survival. And through the frost-laden morning, the remnants of the pocket pressed onward, measured, quiet, and painfully resilient. Some groups moved faster, some slower, each shaped by terrain, exhaustion, and the quiet pulse of determination threading through frozen fields. Horses shifted rhythmically, mist curling into the air, supporting the fragile human cadence. Columns adjusted formation, merging where possible, maintaining coordination, without urgency, moving in gentle waves. Snow drifted softly over uneven ground, highlighting edges, obscuring hazards, and shaping careful passage. Lanterns remained unused, fires absent, the pale daylight providing guidance without intrusion. Whispers, gestures, and subtle cues carried instruction, reassurance, and rhythm across fragmented units. Every careful step reinforced fragile cohesion, each breath a quiet marker of endurance. The distant horizon promised relief, yet each moment pressed forward remained uncertain, measured and deliberate. Horses and men moved together, intertwined in fragile momentum and quiet resilience. And beneath pale winter skies, the fragments of the pocket continued westward, patient, human, and enduring. By afternoon, relief forces finally linked with remnants, merging scattered columns into tenuous cohesion. Soldiers paused briefly, adjusting packs, sharing blankets, lending hands, and offering quiet encouragement. Horses exhaled warmth, muscles relaxing after long exertion, rhythm returning to movement. Snow drifted softly across shoulders and frozen ground, muffling sound, while marking passage and rhythm. Lanterns remained dark, eyes attuned to frost, subtle terrain cues, and instinct, guiding step by careful step. Whispers threaded along lines, gestures coordinating movement and breathing, embedding rhythm in fragmented formations. Some units were intact enough to continue, while others remained scattered, lost to frost, river, or battlefield. Every breath, glance, and motion carried significance, a quiet testament to human endurance in frozen rhythm. And through snow, silence, and exhaustion, The fragile pulse of survival continued, carrying fragments toward temporary safety and quiet reflection. The snow lay thick and undisturbed across the open steppe, broken only by the faint impressions of boots and hooves that had passed in desperate rhythm. Abandoned villages stood quiet, roofs dusted with frost, doors hanging open as if exhaling the memories of hurried departures. Fields bore the traces of movement, lines pressed into snow by soldiers, horses, and equipment, now still, leaving only the soft whisper of wind across frozen earth. The air was crisp, carrying the subtle scent of frost, wood smoke from distant fires, and the muted perfume of wintered fields. Horses wandered slowly among remnants of the battle, nostrils exhaling warm mist, muscles relaxed, instinct guiding movement without urgency. Soldiers moved quietly, observing, counting, and attending to duties that the rush of action had not permitted. Small groups gathered scattered equipment, each item a testament to both human effort and sudden absence. Villagers ventured from hiding places, shuffling carefully through frost, gathering what remained and burying the fallen in shallow frozen graves. Lanterns remained dim or absent, eyes adjusting to pale winter light, reflecting softly on snow. And beneath this hush of frozen fields and silent villages, the steppe held its breath, calm, patient, and contemplative. Corpses lay quietly among abandoned wagons, broken carts, and scattered supplies, still in the rhythm of sudden interruption. Snow drifted softly over edges of cloth, leather, and metal, muting outlines while preserving memory. The faint crunch of boots across frost marked movement as Soviet troops walked methodically, counting prisoners and recording names where possible. Horses stirred gently in response, hooves shifting in snow, breath misting into the cold air, a subtle rhythm of life among stillness. Villagers bent quietly over frozen earth, using hands, spades, or simple gestures to create resting places for the departed. Lanterns remained low, fires absent, pale daylight, guiding careful steps and attention. Soldiers and civilians alike moved with muted respect, gestures deliberate, movements measured. The steppe carried sound sparsely, every footfall amplified by the hush of frozen ground. Snow drifted into shallow depressions, softening edges, blurring distinctions between path, field, and grave. And in this fragile quiet, the rhythm of life and memory intertwined gently with the silence of winter. Broken wagons and scattered equipment hinted at hurried departures, frozen in abrupt stasis under frost-laden skies. Snow drifted over wheels and harnesses, shaping both perception and quiet narrative of what had passed. Horses picked their way cautiously, sniffing the cold air, muscles responding with gentle precision. Soldiers adjusted packs, gathered tools, and counted what remained, a slow and deliberate rhythm guiding action through calm and reflection. Villagers moved among them, shuffling slowly, voices hushed, hands gentle as they tended the frozen dead. Lanterns stayed dim, relying on pale daylight and instinct, every step measured in both care and contemplation. Snow settled over tracks, softening sound and marking passage in gentle patterns. Horses exhaled warm mist into the cold morning, muscles shifting subtly as companions guided rhythm. Soldiers and civilians shared quiet coordination, gestures threading cohesion across the still landscape. And beneath the pale sky, the steppe preserved a delicate calm, a rhythm of memory and endurance. The wind drifted across frozen fields, carrying soft echoes of movement, breath, and frost. Threading through abandoned villages and open plains, soldiers paused periodically, hands resting lightly on harnesses, eyes scanning frozen terrain with careful attention. Horses shifted weight softly, nostrils flaring, breath rising in visible clouds that mingled with wintered air. Villagers worked methodically, creating small mounds for the departed, their movements rhythmic, almost meditative. Lanterns remained subdued, fires absent, pale sunlight reflecting softly across snow and frozen earth. Equipment and belongings were gathered, pockets of action moving slowly, deliberately, across silent villages and frost-bitten fields. Snow drifted lightly over corners of roofs, between fences and along broken roads, softening the edges of memory. Soldiers exchanged quiet words, gestures of reassurance, threading subtle rhythm into the calm cadence of survival. Horses and men moved in tentative, shared rhythm, a gentle pulse connecting life to frozen earth. And through this measured quiet, the steppe held a reflective stillness, patient, contemplative, and enduring. Amid scattered carts and abandoned rifles, small groups of survivors paused to adjust their own stride, breathing visible in crisp air. Horses nickered softly, muscles relaxing after the long exertion of escape, exhaling warmth that mingled with frozen mist. Soldiers bent to gather what remained, a glove, a coat, a tool, each item a quiet testament to continuity and memory. Villagers adjusted blankets over frozen ground, hands moving with deliberate rhythm, tracing gestures of respect across shallow graves. Lanterns were dim, fires absent, the pale winter light guiding both eyes and thought. Snow shifted subtly underfoot, masking previous tracks while marking new rhythm of movement. Horses responded to soft touches and quiet commands, muscles rippling in coiled grace, instinctively guiding balance. Soldiers and civilians moved in shared rhythm, gestures and breath shaping calm forward motion. Every small act of attention carried weight, threading memory and reflection into stillness. And in the hush of morning frost, the steppe held gentle equilibrium, quiet and reverent. Fields that had once echoed with movement now lay still, interrupted only by occasional shifting snow or distant stirrings of horses. Soldiers moved deliberately, pausing to observe, adjust, and consider, embedding rhythm into careful motion. Villagers moved quietly among frozen buildings, tracing paths, carrying out small tasks, tending the dead with steady hands. Horses shifted under light guidance, nostrils flaring, breath rising in rhythmic mist, muscles responding with gentle obedience. Lanterns remained dark, fires suppressed, daylight shaping perception and careful steps. Snow drifted softly across paths, roofs and fences, muffling sound while marking the subtle pulse of motion. Soldiers exchanged whispers, coordinating movements and rhythm with muted attention, gestures threading cohesion through fragile groups. Each step, each glance, each breath carried significance, embedding human presence into silent terrain. Horses, soldiers, and villagers moved together, a subtle shared cadence across frost and memory, and across the quiet white steppe, calm prevailed, holding a rhythm of reflection and endurance. Silent roads stretched between abandoned villages, dusted with snow, each footprint tracing the pulse of a fractured history. Soldiers and horses moved slowly along these paths, steps measured, breath forming gentle clouds in the cold morning air. Villagers bent quietly over shallow graves, hands steady rhythm of digging, and placement soft yet persistent. Lanterns were dim, fires absent, relying on daylight and intuition to guide careful movement. Horses shifted beneath gentle guidance, muscles responding with instinctive rhythm, exhaling warmth into frozen surroundings. Soldiers paused periodically, adjusting equipment, lending hands, and offering subtle reassurance to both comrades and animals. Snow drifted lightly across roofs and paths, softening the outlines of broken villages and field boundaries. Every whispered word, gesture, and careful step carried weight, threading fragile order through stillness. Horses, men, and villagers moved together in tentative rhythm, a shared cadence of endurance and reflection, and through the frozen silence of the steppe, a delicate calm threaded across the landscape, patient, human, and enduring. By afternoon, the battlefield had settled into a haunting equilibrium, the snow-absorbing sound, preserving memory, and holding both life and absence in quiet balance. Soldiers and horses paused to rest briefly, adjusting loads, muscles easing after exertion, breath drifting into frosted air. Villagers continued their work among scattered remains, hands steady, movements rhythmic, tracing care into the frozen earth. Lanterns remained low or absent, daylight shaping perception, rhythm guided by subtle cues and instinct. Snow drifted over frozen tracks, softening evidence of frantic movement, while marking deliberate passage. Soldiers exchanged quiet observations, gestures threading coordination across fragile lines of effort. Horses shifted gently, muscles responding to careful guidance, a rhythm shared with human companions. Every movement, breath, and glance carried significance, embedding calm persistence into the frozen terrain. Paths through abandoned villages, across fields and along frozen roads traced the quiet pulse of memory and life. And beneath pale winter skies, the steppe rested, serene, reflective, and enduring, a delicate balance between history and stillness. The morning light stretched softly across frozen fields, illuminating the fragile traces of a battle long in motion, but now still. Columns of survivors moved slowly, boots crunching lightly over frost, carrying both exhaustion and relief in measured rhythm. Horses adjusted to firm ground, muscles relaxing, warm breath, mingling with icy air in gentle clouds. Soldiers paused along paths, checking equipment, tending to minor injuries, and offering quiet reassurance to one another. Snow drifted over tracks and scattered equipment, softening impressions, preserving memory while guiding cautious steps. Villagers and locals moved through abandoned villages, collecting what remained, their gestures slow, deliberate, and attentive. Lanterns remained dim, fires suppressed, the pale winter sunlight serving as a quiet guide through frozen terrain. Orders were minimal, whispers passing along lines, threading coordination into a delicate rhythm of recovery. In this fragile stillness, the magnitude of loss and survival pressed gently on minds, shaping reflection. And beneath pale skies, the steppe seemed to breathe with a calm equilibrium, patient, observant, and enduring. Survivors counted quietly, realizing that around 30,000 had made the trek from Encirclement, fragments woven into tenuous formations. Their movements were slow and deliberate, each step marked by fatigue and the weight of memory. Horses exhaled warm mist, muscles stretching and relaxing with rhythmic ease. Companions in fragile persistence. Soldiers adjusted packs, blankets, and harnesses, offering hands to those faltering gestures small but resonant. Snow drifted softly over frozen fields and abandoned roads, muffling distant sounds, while highlighting subtle changes in terrain. Villagers continued to tend the land and graves, each motion careful, reflective, imbued with quiet respect. Lanterns remained dark, relying on pale light and instinct to shape movement and perception. Conversations were sparse, words measured, a rhythm of acknowledgement, threading through tired formations. Soldiers glanced toward distant forests and villages, measuring progress, counting distance, and gauging both safety and uncertainty. And through this measured, quiet reflection, the pulse of human endurance continued, fragile but resilient. Yet the toll remained stark. with roughly 40,000 left behind, absorbed into frost, rivers, and the silent sweep of wintered fields. Columns moved slowly past abandoned equipment, wagons, and scattered stores, each item a ghost of hurried departure. Horses trotted gently beside riders, muscles coiled in habitual rhythm, exhaling warmth into icy air. Soldiers shared quiet words, gestures, and glances, threading subtle coordination and reassurance through the fragile, fractured formations. Snow drifted across paths, softening edges and masking traces of hurried movement, guiding rhythm without intrusion. Villagers and locals continued to bury the fallen in shallow graves, hands moving in measured repetition, shaping quiet memorials across frozen ground. Lanterns were low or absent, relying on pale daylight to illuminate subtle changes in terrain and gentle rhythm of steps. Horses shifted weight softly, responding to cues and instinct, muscles moving in gentle cadence. Soldiers observed with quiet attention, noting gaps, absences, and the ghostly remnants of units no longer whole. And beneath the pale winter light, the steppe carried both memory and reflection, patient, enduring, and measured. Soviet forces moved with gentle coordination across the open fields, counting prisoners and consolidating control over the emptied horseshoe of battle. Their movements were careful, measured, disciplined, each action contributing to rhythm of stability after chaotic motion. Horses and supply trains adjusted to frozen terrain, muscles flexing and relaxing, breath misting into the cold air. Officers communicated with quiet gestures, threads of coordination, weaving structure through tens of thousands of men. Snow drifted lightly over tracks and paths, muffling sound, guiding perception, and marking rhythm for movement. Villagers observed cautiously, interacting gently with soldiers and animals, their steps deliberate and careful. Lanterns remained dark, relying on pale daylight to illuminate frozen roads, abandoned villages, and scattered equipment. Soldiers paused periodically, assessing terrain, tending minor needs, and threading subtle rhythm into the march of control. Each movement, glance, and breath carried significance, embedding order and reflection into frozen fields. And through measured, deliberate steps, the Soviet forces shaped quiet authority across the emptied steppe. German morale among the surviving fragments remained fragile, haunted by memory, loss, and the lingering shadow of encirclement. Soldiers walked slowly, boots crunching softly across snow, eyes lowered, muscles stiff from exertion and cold. Horses exhaled warm clouds into pale air, muscles easing into gentle rhythm, companions in the measured march forward. Officers conferred quietly, decisions threaded with reflection and weight, every motion deliberate. Snow drifted lightly over shoulders and frozen ground, softening edges, preserving memory, and guiding careful steps. Lanterns were low, fires absent, daylight shaping perception of terrain, formation, and forward path. Soldiers adjusted packs, blankets, and harnesses, lending hands and offering reassurance, gestures small but resonant. Conversation was sparse, words whispered, gestures guiding both cohesion and rhythm. Each step carried both relief and reflection, threading human endurance through frost-laden silence. And beneath the pale sky, the pocket's remnants pressed onward, carrying memory, fragility, and measured resolve. The steppe itself seemed to exhale, wind drifting gently across fields, over abandoned villages and frozen rivers, carrying a sense of measured calm. Snow shifted lightly, muffling sound, marking paths, and highlighting subtle undulations in terrain. Horses shifted rhythmically, muscles responding to both instinct and human guidance, breath visible in the crisp winter air. Soldiers moved carefully, attending to both companions and surroundings, every gesture imbued with quiet purpose. Lanterns remained low, relying on diffused daylight and instinct to guide deliberate steps across frozen ground. Villagers moved gently among abandoned buildings, tending graves and lingering traces of the departed, weaving human rhythm into silent earth. Conversations were minimal, words measured, gestures deliberate, a subtle cadence threading through the stillness. Soldiers paused briefly to assess both terrain and endurance, embedding patience into movement. Every step, glance, and exhalation contributed to the fragile rhythm of recovery and reflection. And through frost, silence, and memory, the steppe held calm equilibrium, patient, contemplative, and enduring. In scattered villages, frozen equipment and abandoned supplies remained, silent markers of sudden evacuation and desperate decision. Soldiers and horses passed slowly, observing, adjusting, and coordinating movement through careful rhythm. Snow drifted lightly across rooftops, paths, and fields, softening impressions and threading subtle patterns into frozen ground. Villagers worked methodically, hands steady, movements rhythmic, tracing gestures of care and remembrance across shallow graves. Lanterns remained dim, fires absent, daylight providing clarity without intrusion. Soldiers exchanged quiet gestures and soft words, threading subtle coordination into fragile formations. Horses shifted gently, muscles coiled and relaxed in rhythm. With human companions, every movement, glance, and breath carried significance, embedding human endurance and reflection into frozen terrain. Columns traced careful paths across abandoned fields, a delicate pulse of survival and order, and beneath pale winter light, the aftermath of the horseshoe settled, measured, enduring, and quietly reckoned. By afternoon, the frost-laden fields had become a reflective quiet, the echoes of battle softened into memory, carrying both loss and survival in gentle balance. Soldiers moved deliberately, boots crunching lightly over snow, eyes scanning terrain, muscles shifting in gentle cadence. Horses exhaled warmth into cold air, breath visible, rhythm guiding both energy and motion. Villagers continued quiet tasks, tending shallow graves, gathering remnants and preserving memory with deliberate care. Lanterns were low or absent, daylight illuminating frost and frozen earth with gentle impartiality. Soldiers offered hands, shared blankets, and lent warmth to both comrades and horses, gestures threading calm rhythm into movement. Snow drifted softly across fields and roads, muffling distant sound, while marking rhythm and passage. Every glance, gesture, and step carried weight, embedding quiet reflection and endurance into the steppe. Horses, men, and villagers moved together, a subtle shared cadence across frozen terrain. And through the measured afternoon light, the aftermath pressed onward, patient, human, and enduring. Long after the snow had melted and the frost had receded, survivors carried memories that refused to settle quietly. Letters folded in pockets, diaries hidden in packs, and memoirs written in careful script traced the invisible paths of frozen fields. Soldiers recalled voices lost in the cold, horses that had carried them through white silence, and comrades whose absence remained palpable. Villagers remembered the hush of wintered villages, the sudden departures, and the quiet aftermath that settled over homes and fields. Each testimony held rhythm, small gestures of endurance and presence, threading life through memory. Lanterns of recollection burned softly in quiet rooms, lighting faces with reflection and the gentle weight of remembrance. Snowfall and frost became metaphors, recalled with tactile clarity, the bite of cold air, the shimmer of ice under pale skies. Through these quiet voices, the battle remained alive, measured in emotion and memory, rather than motion. Every written word, whispered memory, and paused breath carried the cadence of reflection across years, and through all recollection, the cauldron of Korsun lived softly, echoing across time with patient resonance. German soldiers wrote slowly, their pens tracing both lines and tremors, remembering comrades' decisions and the fragile rhythm of survival. Diaries captured hesitation, exhaustion, and the quiet hum of human connection beneath relentless winter skies. Letters sent home carried fragments of warmth and restraint, masking fear while preserving connection. Horses, snow, and frost were remembered vividly, companions and obstacles woven into the tapestry of survival. Equipment abandoned, villages passed in quiet procession, and fleeting moments of camaraderie were etched into memory. Lanterns of imagination lit small rooms, casting shadows over words and thoughts, drawing warmth from recollection. Soldiers paused over entries, tracing pen over paper, feeling distance as both pain and reflection. Even after decades, the pulse of the cauldron lingered, shaping rhythm of thought and memory with gentle insistence. Each page, sentence, and pause reflected both endurance and quiet grief, threading life into the emptiness left behind. And through these testimonies, the battlefield persisted, silent, reflective, and patient. Soviet soldiers, too, carried memories, softer perhaps, but no less resonant, of the winter advance and the careful pursuit of encirclement. Memoirs recalled frozen rivers, measured advances, and the steady rhythm of coordinated effort across snow-bound fields. Diaries traced small gestures of human endurance, the subtle acts of aid and attention among comrades. Horses and equipment were recalled as companions, guiding and supporting in both silence and exertion. Villagers remembered the cautious approach, the quiet orders, and the rhythm of organized movement through frozen land. Lanterns of memory flickered softly, illuminating paths through years of reflection, shaping rhythm of thought and observation. Each recorded recollection carried the weight of presence, the gentle echo of footsteps across snow, and the cold breath of morning frost. Soldiers paused over pages, tracing paths and gestures in thought, reliving the measured cadence of winter advance. Memories threaded carefully through time, a soft pattern of endurance and continuity. And in these reflections, the cauldron's story persisted, quiet, enduring, and patient. Letters, both sent and preserved, became vessels of emotion, capturing both terror and tenderness in measured tones. Words were folded, hidden, and revisited, each line carrying a cadence of careful thought, emotion held softly beneath restraint. Soldiers' hands traced familiar lines, recalling the warmth of companions, the whisper of wind across frozen fields, the subtle rhythm of frozen rivers. Villagers' writings captured observation, fear, and compassion, threading small gestures into narrative that survived the years. Diaries recorded breath, step, and the quiet pulse of winter days, embedding rhythm into memory as much as action. Lanterns of recollection illuminated rooms where time moved slowly, and reflection allowed the cauldron to be felt without urgency. Pages carried rhythm, structure, and the gentle beat of remembrance through spaces of silence and stillness. Horses, snow, and frost remained constants, companions in memory as in motion. Every word, pause, and exhalation in recollection carried weight, threading endurance into fragile narrative. And across letters, diaries, and memoirs, the story of Korsun drifted gently, persistent and reflective. Memories often returned not as chronological motion, but as impressions: the cold bite of frost, the shimmer of ice, the silent step of a horse through snow. Soldiers recalled small comforts, shared bread, whispered words, and brief laughter threading rhythm through long hours. Villagers remembered hands resting on frozen wood, warmth offered, and cautious gestures of assistance or attention. Lanterns flickered across memory, casting gentle illumination on recollected paths, abandoned villages, and subtle human rhythm. Diaries traced thought and feeling, embedding pauses, hesitation, and careful reflection into each line. Snow drifted softly across pages in thought, the imagination reconstructing fields, rivers, and forests in delicate patterns. Horses shifted in recollection, muscles flexing in memory, breath forming visible clouds across imagined frost. Soldiers paused in thought, each gesture of memory echoing rhythm of past movement and effort. Words, whispers, and recollections carried cadence, threading continuity through years of quiet reflection, and through these impressions, the cauldron remained alive, echoing softly across time and memory. Survivors often described silence as the most resonant presence, the pause between movement, thought, and breath that carried more weight than any action. Letters and diaries echoed with quiet rhythms, the unspoken spaces shaping the perception of events long past. Villagers and soldiers alike remembered frozen mornings, soft wind over snow, the subtle shuffle of boots and hooves across frost. Lanterns of imagination illuminated these memories with gentle attention, tracing paths through terrain both physical and emotional. Horses became companions of reflection, carrying presence and rhythm in both motion and thought. Words written softly, read repeatedly, threaded rhythm into the memory of frozen fields, abandoned equipment, and quiet villages. Each pause, each exhalation, each gesture in recollection carried weight, embedding human presence into history. Snow and frost in memory became metaphors, tactile markers of endurance, fragility, and subtle continuity. Diaries, letters, and memoirs wove together to create a soft echo, carrying voices of memory across time. And through this echo, the cauldron whispered persistently, patient, reflective, and enduring. Even decades later, testimonies carried rhythm, subtle cadence, and gentle reflection across generations. Soldiers' grandchildren read letters aloud, pausing to trace handwriting, hear voices carried softly across paper, and feel the gentle rhythm of memory. Villagers' accounts were preserved in memoirs, archives, and quiet conversation, shaping local understanding of events and enduring echoes of human presence. Horses, frost, and snow were remembered vividly, companions of both action and reflection, shaping perception of rhythm across time. Diaries traced breath, pause, and careful gestures, each entry a small vessel of endurance, memory, and delicate continuity. Lanterns of thought illuminated frozen villages, abandoned fields, and faint traces of movement, embedding rhythm into contemplation. Each recalled step, glance, and exhalation contributed to understanding and emotional resonance. Memories threaded through letters, diaries, and recollections formed a quiet pulse, echoing in rhythm across years. Every story, whispered or written, contributed to the soft persistence of the cauldron's memory. And through all reflection, the cauldron of Korsun remained patient, enduring and quietly present in human consciousness. In the hush of quiet evenings, the steppe seemed to carry voices, a gentle resonance of endurance, loss, and human rhythm. Soldiers, villagers, and descendants recalled subtle gestures, breath, movement, and care threaded across frozen fields and abandoned villages. Letters and diaries offered rhythm, pacing memory into a calm cadence that honored presence and absence alike. Horses, snow, and frost persisted in recollection, companions and markers of fragile continuity. Lanterns of thought glowed softly, illuminating paths through memory, shaping reflection without urgency. Words, whispers, and gestures threaded across time, preserving rhythm, emotion, and endurance in delicate patterns. Every recalled moment, breath, and gesture carried significance, echoing softly through history. Diaries and memoirs stitched together memory, reflection, and narrative into a quiet pulse of human presence. Snow drifted over imagined fields, softening edges, highlighting rhythm, and carrying memory forward. And beneath pale skies of remembrance, the cauldron whispered its story, echoing patiently, calmly, and persistently into the quiet of history. The Ukrainian steppe lies vast and open, its gentle slopes softened by seasons that have passed since the winter of 1944. Villages have been rebuilt, roofs gleaming under warm sunlight, roads swept clean of debris and memory. Yet the snow, when it returns, seems to recall each silent footstep, each measured breath, and each fragile heartbeat that once marked the landscape. Fields that once bore the tracks of men and horses now lie still, pale, and even, carrying echoes beneath the surface. Rivers glide calmly, their icy edges long since thawed, yet their quiet currents seem to hum with stories of survival and loss. Trees sway gently in the wind, whispering softly over villages and fields, as if attentive to memories buried beneath roots and frozen soil. Farmers work in rhythm with the seasons, unaware of the subtle pulse of history threading through the ground beneath their hands. Lanterns of reflection flicker in the imagination, illuminating past and present in gentle succession. The snow holds its silence carefully, neither accusing nor consoling, merely remembering with patient grace. And beneath pale winter skies, the steppe breathes slowly, carrying memory forward in quiet cadence. Across open fields, traces of history linger in subtle shifts of terrain, dips where wagons once struggled and furrows where horses collapsed. Soldiers' footsteps, long faded, are now mirrored only in imagination, their rhythm echoed in the soft crunch of fresh snow. Villagers pass over these places, their hands shaping earth, planting seeds, tending animals, weaving calm continuity through living action. Horses graze slowly in open pastures, their breath misting in crisp air, companions to both memory and present life. Lanterns of thought illuminate small gestures, letters folded and preserved, diaries held gently in worn hands, stories transmitted quietly across generations. Each recalled movement threads rhythm through the present, a cadence of reflection that is neither hurried nor forced. Snow blankets everything evenly, preserving absence and presence with impartial grace, softening edges and marking the gentle pulse of time. Children run across frozen fields in winter, unaware, but participating in the rhythm of continuity that stretches across years. Every path, every breath of wind, every shift in light carries memory softly, shaping consciousness without urgency. And through these subtle traces, the snow remembers, patient, calm, and enduring. Memories of those encircled are carried in quiet gestures, letters, and stories shared softly among families and communities. Survivors, long-aged, speak rarely but with rhythm and care, threading human presence into recollection. Frosted rivers, abandoned villages, and the lingering chill of wintered fields return in their accounts, soft yet persistent in detail. Horses, carts, and measured steps are recalled as companions, silent witnesses to endurance and fragility alike. Lanterns of thought flicker across recollections, illuminating shadows of the past with gentle warmth. Snow drifts over imagined battlefields, covering both loss and survival in uniform. Whiteness, shaping memory into calm, reflective cadence. Each pause in speech or writing carries weight, allowing reflection to settle, unhurried and intentional. Villagers and descendants integrate history into routine life, subtle gestures of attention, marking rhythm of remembrance. The steppe itself seems to inhale, listening, shaping continuity through seasons, through frost, through sun. And in this quiet the snow keeps vigil, patient, watchful, and softly resonant. Winter evenings bring a gentle hush, the landscape transformed into soft contours under moonlight and snow. Roofs gleam lightly, trees sway in the whispering wind, and rivers reflect the silvered glow of pale skies. Footsteps are muffled, voices softened, and every motion carries a calm, measured rhythm that mirrors long-forgotten paths. Horses move with gentle awareness, muscles shifting in the soft cadence of instinct and memory. Lanterns of reflection illuminate imagined steps of soldiers, fleeting moments of camaraderie, and careful gestures of survival. Snow drifts evenly across fields, shaping silent impressions of what was and what remains, balancing memory and present life. Children hear stories of frost and endurance, of winter marches and quiet heroism, threading reflection into playful rhythm. Conversations flow softly, pauses measured, gestures deliberate, embedding continuity into life and remembrance. Each breath of wind carries history lightly, threading awareness through perception without urgency. And beneath quiet skies, the snow remembers, patient, calm, and deeply resonant. The steppe itself seems to cradle memory, holding both absence and presence in its gentle expanse. Hills and valleys appear softened, but the rhythm of past movement lingers in subtle impressions beneath frost and earth. Villagers walk slowly across fields, hands brushing snow, tracing gestures that echo long-forgotten routines. Horses breathe softly, muscles coiled and relaxed in equilibrium, companions in both history and present life. Lanterns of thought illuminate subtle markers of endurance, letters, diaries, and faint traces of human rhythm across the frozen ground. Snow drifts silently over old tracks, wagons, and signs of passage, preserving memory while guiding perception in measured cadence. Every exhalation, every whisper, every careful step threads presence into continuity, embedding quiet reflection into landscape. Children laugh softly, unaware, but connected, echoing the pulse of life across time. Farmers pause in their labor, attentive to rhythm of seasons, subtly observing the whispers beneath soil and frost. And through all this the snow remembers, carrying endurance, reflection, and human presence gently across the steppe. Memories of sacrifice and stubbornness linger in quiet cadence, carried softly through letters, diaries, and stories shared across tables and hearths. Soldiers and villagers, long removed from frosted fields, speak with measured care, gestures deliberate, voices calm, threading rhythm through narrative. Frosted rivers, snow-laden villages, and wind-swept pastures are recalled vividly, companions to thought and reflection. Horses, tools, and carts form part of remembered rhythm, grounding the pulse of endurance in tangible detail. Lanterns illuminate these reflections, casting gentle light across quiet rooms, drawing attention to absence, presence, and subtle continuity. Snow settles evenly, softening edges, preserving memory without urgency or imposition. Each pause, each breath, each line of recollection carries gentle weight, threading human presence into landscape and consciousness alike. Fields stretch across horizons, carrying echoes of frozen footsteps and fleeting moments of survival. Rivers glide silently, hills breathe softly, and wind whispers across the steppe, threading calm rhythm through memory. And beneath this patient watch, the snow remembers, quiet, enduring, and deeply attentive. Even as seasons change, the rhythm of memory remains, soft and persistent, threading the past through the living present. Children play across snow-laden fields, unaware of the weight beneath, yet participating in the gentle cadence of continuity. Horses move through pastures with ease, muscles shifting softly in alignment with instinct and human presence. Villagers attend to fields, animals, and routines, gestures deliberate and imbued with quiet reflection. Letters and diaries are revisited, stories told softly at tables, voices low, cadence measured, rhythm deliberate. Lanterns illuminate moments of reflection, small spaces of memory, threaded with care across time. Snow drifts gently over frozen traces, marking rhythm and shaping perception, preserving presence while softening edges. Every pause, gesture, and breath carries the quiet pulse of history, embedding continuity in thought and action. Soldiers' memories, civilians' recollections, and children's play merge into a subtle cadence, shaping awareness and reflection. And through all seasons and years, the snow remembers, patient, calm, and enduring. In the final hush of winter, the steppe exhales slowly, the landscape holding memory, like breath held in soft suspension. Villages sleep beneath snow-laden roofs, fields shimmer with pale frost, and rivers whisper quietly beneath ice. Horses shift weight softly, breath-forming clouds in frigid air, companions in rhythm and endurance. Lanterns of reflection illuminate quiet corners, letters, diaries, and human presence embedded across time and space. Snow drifts evenly across fields and paths, preserving impressions, softening edges, and marking gentle continuity. Children run, villagers pause, horses breathe, and the land itself seems to listen attentively, holding all in subtle equilibrium. Every step, every exhalation, every remembered gesture threads human presence into landscape, quiet yet persistent. Frost and snow, wind and light, carry echoes of stubbornness, sacrifice, and endurance, shaping awareness in measured cadence. Through this rhythm, memory, and presence, the landscape itself becomes storyteller, patient, reflective, and enduring. And beneath pale skies and drifting snow, the steppe remembers, softly, calmly, and with eternal patience.